everybody. Right, we'll start with the morning's agenda, and I'll ask the Chief Executive if he reports any apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Councillor Reid, Councillor Mrs Rawlins and Councillor Mrs Cooper.
Thank you. Do we have any councillors wishing to declare any interest?
Councillor Poles had to go back home to assist his wife, so he'll be absent today.
We'll move on to item 3.
Items 6 and 7 relating to the Lincolnshire Southern Bypass. My family have land that's of interest for that development, so I'll remove myself for that one. Thank you.
Move on to approve the minutes of the meeting of the County Council held on the 15th of December 2017, and that they be approved as a correct record and signed by me later. Do I have a seconder? Yes, please, Councillor Talbot.
Can I just say that my declaration of interest on item 13 on the 15th of December, item 50 in relation to the independent remuneration panel, and my declaration that the new member, one of the new members, was a close family friend, has not been recorded on page 10 of today's agenda, in between Councillor Mrs Woolley's motion on the British Legion count team and Councillor Parker's motion, which is when I stood up having taken advice from the Chief Whip that I should have declared it at the beginning of the meeting. It's not in any of the paperwork, so I would like that amendment to be included if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Talbot. Move on. Do we have a seconder for the to approve the minutes? Do you want to do that?
Yeah. I'll second that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. All those in favour that the minutes are correct?
Chairman, will that amendment be...
Subject to that amendment, yes. I was expecting a Mexican wave then. Thank you very much. Move on to my announcements. The only announcements, I have two announcements to make. That I wish to thank my Vice Chairman and Lady, Councillor Ron and Di Oxby, for the representing us at civic functions that we've been unable to attend. It's with sadness that I have to report the death of former County Councillor Eric Davis, who represented the Spalding East and Western electoral division from 1993 to 1997. As you are all aware, this will be the last full council meeting for our Chief Executive, Tony McArdle. On behalf of this council, I would like to thank Tony for his hard work and commitment over the past 12 years and wish him all the best for the future. And I'd like to add my personal thanks for the elbow in the ribs every time I get it wrong. I invite group leaders to say a few words, as there will be opportunities at a later stage during the day for others to add their words. Thank you. Councillor Martin Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, well, Tony obviously has been with us
for 12 years now, 12 and a half years, and those of us who were around at the time, it's nearly 13 years since we started the process of recruiting a new chief executive. And back in those days, back in 2005, we were slowly emerging from a very difficult period in the life of this council, which most of us hopefully have don't try and remember, because it was a very difficult place for various reasons, and we were subject to some, we'd already had some issues about the corporate governance inspection, which came along following difficulties of two previous leaders, and it was quite clear from that corporate governance inspection that things needed to improve, and we had Sir Les Elton, who came in, a former chief executive of Gateshead, who came in, and we were really under his watchful eye, shall we say. So it was very important when we recruited a new chief executive that we move forward. Tony previously been chief executive at Wellingborough, and been there for some time, and actually had a very successful career there as bringing that borough council forward. So we had a extensive interview, which some of us are still here. Rob, I remember being on the panel as well, and Tony emerged as the choice. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. In the last 12 years, not only have we emerged from a difficult period where Lincolnshire County Council almost became a laughingstock nationally, or somewhere to be pitted, to where we are today, and working with members. Now we know that, for example, in many of our services, for example, children's services, highways, and adults is another one, where we are actually either excellent or good or very well regarded in what we do. We've managed the very difficult process of managing the reduction in funding, but protecting frontline services as well, very well. As an individual, Tony is very much what you get. There is no side to him. He has that Irish charm which comes out to play from time to time. But I can tell you, when things are tough and you're in a corner, he has been one of those people you want to rely on to come up with a solution, and come up with a solution works with everybody. I've yet to meet anybody who's got a bad word to say about Tony, and he does do his best, and he works well with councillors across the piece. And when I talk to people who in Northamptonshire from all colours of the political spectrum, they all remember him, those who were there then, with some affection. So he's done a really excellent job for us over 12 years as chief executive of this organisation. He has very much a devolutionist style, which has worked because he's enabled others to rise up to the challenge and let them deliver the job as they think fit. So I think 12 years is a long time as well. It's quite, the average span for most chief executives is probably 6 or half that, 6 years maybe. So it is a long period, and I think it's right, both the organisation, as he reaches his 60th birthday, for the organisation and for Tony himself to have a change. But notwithstanding that, he's done an excellent job for this authority, very well respected. Of course, he's also was chairman of the Association of County Chief Executives, well respected by government civil servants and the like. He's done a really good job for us at Lincolnshire County Council. Not sure whether he's going to be able to stay in the county, because obviously he'll move on to other jobs, because he's not ready to retire just yet. But we will wish him and Santa very well for the future, and thank you very much, Tony, for an excellent job done.
Thank you, Councillor Hill. Councillor Marianne Overton.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I would like to add my support to the words just made by Councillor Hill. I was also on the Appointments Committee at the beginning, and we worked through some very substantial and excellent candidates, and it was really good to find somebody who would be good at partnership working and bringing the district councils and the county council to closer working. And I think that is something that has been a success over the years, despite the ups and downs that happen from time to time. So a huge thank you, always a sound, listening, straightforward ear, always working towards the best for Lincolnshire, and greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Overton. Councillor Angela Newton.
Thank you, Chairman. We would like to echo what's already been said about Tony. Not a lot left to say after Martin went on for a few minutes, and but you know, I didn't realise he was such a windbag. But anyway, all nice things, and I know Councillor Brewis was also on the interviewing panel, and things here are much different to how they were years ago. Those of us who've been on some time ago do know it was quite difficult, and it's been much better now, and Tony, under his directorship, it's been a much more inclusive council, and those of us who sit this side or who are not Conservatives have found that we've been included in sharing the information that goes on behind the scenes, and we're grateful for that, and we wish you all the best, you and your family. Hope you're able to stay in Lincolnshire, but we do hope you find something that suits your skills and capabilities, and thank you for what you've done for us since you've been here. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Councillor Rob Parker.
Thank you. As one of the few people that were around in 2005, it's worth reflecting and emphasising what Councillor Hill said about how dark a place Lincolnshire County Council was at that particular time. We've moved on, it's 13 years now, and a lot of councillors were not around at that time. What we needed was, in a sense, a change of political leadership and a change of executive leadership, and Tony came in a difficult situation and handled it, I think, impeccably. I think that the merit of the appointments has been shown by longevity. 12 years is a long time, and also by the feelings that people have got around the county, inside local government and outside local government. And I think that some of the big successes has been, in a sense, the effectiveness of Tony's relationship with the health authorities, the health services in Lincolnshire, and working effectively with the districts. I don't know whether or not when you finished here on the County Council, you remember the word Serco just as well as you remember you're working with local authorities and the National Health Service, but we can't win them all, can we? It does seem as though the view that chief executives are, in a sense, the Sir Humphreys of local government work, behind the scenes, guiding, controlling, influencing, pick any one from that. But it has been an effective working relationship, certainly between Councillor Hill and yourself. And I think also that you've led effectively a management team that has also picked up the culture of inclusiveness, working together as best we can. Speaking from an opposition, there's always more that you expect of a chief executive, you know, information, behind the scenes, all that sort of thing. I think you managed that task effectively. And for my time as leader of the opposition and as leader of the Labour group, I think that you've been an effective leader of the paid services in the way that you've helped me to devise strategy through your inclusiveness and influencing of the directors. I don't know if you're going to spend more time with Norwich, watching Norwich City play. I hope you do. I thought it was only politicians that said they're leaving to spend more time with the family, but at least you're able to say that and go with our good wishes. Thank you for your help, Tony.
Thank you. We'll move on to item 5, questions. And the first question, I'm anxious to allow a good spread of questions across the chamber within the time allocated. I intend to allow 45 minutes for questions, and I expect councillors to be disciplined because of the time available. So first of all, we have Councillor Sarah Dobbs to Martin Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Hill, in the light of the 8% increase in looked after children nationally and the £2 billion predicted funding gap by the LGA in children's social care by 2020, does Councillor Hill still think austerity has been worth the pain, both in a moral and a financial sense?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I mean, I think that's, if I might say so, is rather a typical question you'd get from certain elements within the Labour Party. Life's quite simple, really, whether you're a householder, whether you're a council or whether you're a government. You have to live within your means in the end. You cannot eternally go on spending more money than you're earning. And the situation the Conservative government inherited back in 2010 was this government, on behalf of the country, inherited a situation where £150 billion a year more was being spent by the government than was being raised by income in the government. That situation cannot be going on indefinitely. It just cannot. Because in the end, you rack up so many debts, as in like Greece and other places, that in effect the financial markets lose confidence that you are actually in control of your budget, and you end up with what normally happens, and what happens back in the day of a Labour government in the 60s, the International Monetary Fund move in, and you are under a strict regime of almost slashing and burning. So yes, there has been a period where the government, the coalition government to start with, and then now the Conservative government, has actually got to the stage where it has got to stop piling on debt. And I can't remember the figures, but I think by the time this council meeting is finished, we'll find we've already several hundreds of thousands more in debt as a nation. That situation has to change. So I do think the council has to play its part in doing that. We have done that. I would support Councillor Dawes to say that, and I think others in Labour councillors and Conservative councillors nationally would say, local government has more than done its fair share of finding savings to support the national economy, and really it is time now that the government actually looked in other areas of its own spending to find those savings. And indeed, in terms of the fairer funding review for Lincolnshire, you quoted some of the issues we've got in Lincolnshire. Of course, if we had a fairer funding regime and we got that £116 million extra coming to the county every year, then we could do all sorts of things, including doing even more for looked after children. So no, I don't agree. You actually have to balance your books, and if you don't have a strong economy to pay those taxes and those bills, everybody ends up worse off, including, and we don't really want to be in a situation, for example, like Venezuela, where, frankly, despite having massive oil reserves, people are actually starving on the streets and scrabbling around for food. So I think it has been a painful period, a difficult period. And the good news for us is the County Council has managed to carry on delivering those services. Children's Services, of course, is excellent, as rated, the best in the country almost, so I think we have managed the situation pretty well.
Thank you. We have Councillor Alison Austin to Councillor Richard Davies.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, Happy New Year, Councillor Davis. I think this is our first meeting of the new year, and I didn't want you to feel neglected. Right. Right, very simple question. Let's get on with it. MPs promise to make Towns bypass happen. This is the headline on the front page of this week's Boston Target. Does Councillor Davis share the optimism of Matt Warman, a hard-working and enthusiastic local MP? Thank you.
Well, thank you, and Happy New Year. I don't know whether we're into Chinese New Year yet, but regardless, thank you. Are we? Fantastic. The Year of the Dog. Okay. Well, I won't be offended by that, I'm sure. I have to say, firstly, I'd like to echo your comments about Matt Warman. Politics aside, isn't it nice that we have a fresh-faced, enthusiastic MP who's vociferous campaigning for his local area? I mean, the contrast between him and other urban MPs in Lincolnshire is vast. And I have to say, if anybody can make it happen, I think Matt Warman can. He is constantly badgering myself and Martin. As recently as last Friday, we met. I wasn't able to make it, but Martin and other members of the executive met with Matt specifically in Boston to talk about this and other transport issues. As you may be aware, we've already had our inaugural meeting of the Boston Transport Strategy Group in conjunction with the Boston Borough Council. We're looking at not only the delivery of the bypass, but other improvements built on what we've already done over the last 10 years in the town. I know you're a very vociferous campaigner and won't allow me to take my foot off the pedal. Certainly we're committed to the bypass, the distributor road, and I think if anybody's going to bring that key link, which has to be that big slug of government money to make it happen as we know, then Matt Warman is your man.
Thank you. Councillor Kev Clark to Councillor Richard Davies.
Morning, Councillor Davis. In the last 3 years, £500,000 has been paid out by this authority in pothole claims. The government know potholes are a major issue to local authorities, thus the Pothole Action Fund. The question is in three parts, but it is the same question. What is the cost of the insurance to the authority to cover potholes? B, how much did the council receive from the fund from the government? And C, is any of the funds received from the government used for insurance claims? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In terms of we self-insure, so there are no direct insurance premium costs. The latest claim figures, I think, for last financial year were about £140,000, which is down quite considerably over the last 3 years. I'll make sure I circulate the accurate figures. In terms of where the money goes from funding, it goes into the highways maintenance budget, and then some of that may go towards paying for claims, but obviously the lion's share of it goes towards funding. The latest allocation we've had from the government's pothole fund is about £1.7 million. I think that later on this morning there will be more talk of potholes, but I don't really want to steal the leader's thunder.
Thank you. I have Councillor Matt Bowles for Councillor Colin Davey.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Davey, the demise of Gainsborough Town Centre is having serious economic impacts both on the area of the town and its residents. Over the last few years, the town centre has seen an accelerated decline towards a ghost town. We know it is increasingly deserted by shoppers and has an ever-growing list of empty shops and buildings. The latest and critical blow to the town was the closure of the Aldridge and Downtown department store, which was the biggest store in the town centre and employed hundreds of people and was home to numerous outlets including Burton's, Dorothy Perkins, which are now all lost to the town. Unfortunately, the owners of the building, the Lincolnshire Co-op, are doing nothing and appear all too happy for the building to sit empty. This is nothing short of a disgrace. We already know the next major national business to leave the town will be the NatWest Bank, whose iconic building at the entrance to the town centre will now become an empty eyesore like so many other buildings. This is all compounded by the regular closure of small independent shops that are unable to survive due to high rates and rents, coupled with ever-decreasing footfall in a downward spiral of unsustainability. All of this has been disastrous for the economy of Gainsborough. Firstly, the closure of all these businesses has cost hundreds of local people their jobs. Secondly, the economy of Gainsborough is suffering as local residents now spend their money.
Question session, not a speech-making session. Thank you, Chairman.
Can I ask you to round off?
It's all relevant to the question, Chair. Local residents now spending the money outside of the town and in the county in terms of Retford, Scunthorpe, Doncaster, etc. And the local visitor economy is also suffering.
Can we just get to the question, please?
Please could I ask the portfolio holder for Economy in Place if you are personally aware of the difficulties the town is experiencing, and if so, could you please see what you can do to support businesses in this major Lincolnshire town before it is too late? I would be happy to meet personally to discuss this issue if necessary.
Thank you very much for the long question. I think in a very short answer, I have met with West Lindsey District Council, who are doing a lot of work in terms of economic development around Gainsborough. There is a Gainsborough initiative which you'll be well aware of in terms of bringing investment into the town. I think Gainsborough has underperformed for many years, but I think the development of Marshall's Yard is an absolutely top-notch development in terms of any town in Lincolnshire. And I believe that we'll work closely through the LEP with the District Council, and we will improve Gainsborough for all its residents in the future. And you can see that happening because of the planning applications that are now coming into Gainsborough, which the District Council are dealing with. So I believe that Gainsborough's best years are ahead of it, and we'll work together to make sure that's the case. I'm always happy to meet with you personally to discuss that. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Councillor Lewis Strange for Councillor Richard Davies.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Marianne Overton for Councillor Martin Hill.
Thank you very much, Chairman. The Fairer Funding campaign has been well supported by everybody across the party to make sure that we get the best we can for our area. We've got the business rates 100% come back. We've got some money for care, 150 million divided, and our share was 2.1, and we've got some rural funding which has gone in with the business rates. Would the leader agree that this has been a successful support from a cross-party and also from the Local Government Association to support Lincolnshire in getting a fairer share? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, as Councillor Overton says, the Fair Funding campaign has been very successful. I'm afraid she's wrong when she says that everybody has supported it. Alas, we haven't had total support. We've had near total support. Very welcome the support we've had from unanimous support from councillors in this chamber. Yes, but it has been a successful campaign, and we welcome the support we've received from across the board, not only just in Lincolnshire, from parish councils, from businesses, and all the rest of it, district councils in the main, but also from organisations in Whitehall, in particular the Secretary of State, who actually does recognise, as I'll say in my speech in a minute, where the problem lies. So I think there has been good support, but we need to keep the pressure up, because there are those who, frankly, are much better looked after financially than Lincolnshire and other rural areas. And although the campaign is going very well, we need to keep that pressure up, because there are those who, frankly, are very well looked after, who probably get twice the support that we get, and that's why their council tax is half our council tax level for delivering similar services. They don't want to give up their gains. So I think we have got our word cut out, and I think Councillor Overton has to keep battling for Lincolnshire to make sure those currently who are trying to hold on to their extra money, shall we say, at the expense of Lincolnshire, need to understand that we need a fair system, and that means being fair to everybody. And frankly, it does mean that some people in future might not get as much money as they thought they were going to get in the first place. That's only fair, because we need to get to a better system. So yes, it has been successful, but there is more work to do, and a unanimous support across the whole of Lincolnshire would be very welcome.
Thank you. We have Councillor Graham Cullen for Councillor Trish Bradwell.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Bradwell, explain why residents of mine have seen an increase from £16 to £67 from their lifetime telecare service. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Well, we've had to retender the Wellbeing service and telecare service. Those two obviously work together. They're preventative services. And with going out to retender, obviously the price has increased. So, as you know, the price has gone up from 36p to £2.26. What we are doing is, over the next 4 years, is actually ensuring that people have a steady increase. So this year people will pay £1.50 who are existing service users, and that will increase over the next few years till they get to the full cost. I think we've got to understand at this council, as you'll probably hear later from the leader, about our financial situation. We have to go with what the market offers us. This was the best price, and lots of providers in this area, because we did a lot of checking, are charging around about that to £3. So we know that it's the market price for that type of service, although our previous provider did charge somewhat a lesser amount. So actually we do realise telecare services are key for our residents. You know, it helps to keep people in their own home, where they want to be. And what we're doing is we've got a helpline that's open 7 days a week, and we would ask residents, if they are worried or want to discuss this further, to ring that helpline number so that we can discuss things with them. Because the last thing we want is for someone to stop that service if they really do need it. And I know people in our call centre have been having discussions, and we have reassessed people, and you know, we will continue to help them with that service. We've got 2,000 people in the service who are adult care service users, and again, they need that service for their care, so they will be paying just the £1.50 forever. Their costs won't go up because they need that service and we're supporting them. But obviously new people coming into the service who probably their children or family want to have that knowledge that mum and dad are safe because they've got that button to use, will have to pay the full cost. So as I say, it is a bit of a shock to people, but actually the service is there, they will get new equipment and it will be maintained as well. That didn't happen in the last contract. So if you want any more information, come to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Key for Councillor Richard Davies.
Thank you. Thank you. There's two parts to it, but I'll kick off anyway. Street lighting. Can Councillor Richard Davies please explain why the street lighting budget has been cut when working people are paying double taxation? Information from HMRC states working people are paying towards street lighting as part of their income tax. This document was given to me by a lady who wanted this to be raised. So about £2,000 tax on an income of £16,300. How does this national picture sit with our local tax, i.e. our council tax? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, the immediate response is because the council voted through a budget some time ago that agreed we would reduce the spend on street lighting. I think that's part and parcel of the fact that we've seen a nearly 40% reduction in government grants over by the end of the decade, which amounts to hundreds of millions of pounds, so cuts have to be made, which I think is probably the local aspect of the question. In terms of the broader context, you're absolutely right, but of course taxation goes towards a number of things. For example, adult social care. We've heard conversations from Councillor Cullen already about the cost of telecare going up. The authority as a whole has had to reduce its spend markedly. We will hear from the leader shortly, I think, in terms of his budget speech, about the proposals he's making further. The reality is you can't continue to spend what you don't make. And while you're not getting in the amount of money we would like, you have to cut your cloth accordingly. And one of the difficulties I know that we have between ourselves as Conservatives and perhaps members on the opposite side of the political spectrum is that you can't spend what you don't bring in. You can't, in your own household, I'm sure you don't rack up credit card debts and keep borrowing money you don't have. And likewise, we can't do that here. And one of my frustrations is, because of the costs of many things going up, it does mean some of our core services have been having to be cut. It's a national question, really, isn't it? Where do we spend money? Is it NHS? Is it defence? Is it law or order? Is it local government? I think the point I would make in summary is local government is often forgot about on that national stage. But you're absolutely right, Councillor Key. It's these local issues. Street lights doesn't sound very important, I guess, to the people of Westminster. However, here on the streets of Lincolnshire, it's very important.
Thank you. Councillor Robin Renshaw to Councillor Richard Davies.
Good morning, Richard. You're very busy again, as usual. Whilst I welcome your request in the media for more of the public to report potholes, can you quantify what extra staff will be deployed to manage the anticipated increase in reports? Does that mean that elected members who report these incidents will have to wait longer for actions? And when I say the word actions, I mean for something to be done, not just an automatic response. Because I've reported one corner of Raisin Lane, and it's now become a tank trap, and that's disgusting because people are having to swerve out in the road, and I've highlighted it as a safety occurrence, and I would expect something like that to be done urgently rather than just wait for an accident to happen. Thank you.
I mean, we are deploying extra resources over the winter period into potholes. For example, in East Division, we've deployed some extra maintenance teams, and we've also brought in the jet patcher equipment that I think we've previously talked about that goes around and does some of the automated repairs. Just to clarify, I think two things I would say in response. Whoever reports the pothole or the surface defect will get the same response according to our asset management strategy. This is the document and the practice that we've implemented over the last 2 years, which has led to us being the most highly regarded highways authority in the country. I think it's going to be 2 years on the road. Last time round, we were only one of 2 top-tier authorities in the whole country. And it is this response, which means, frustratingly for me, if I report a pothole, It doesn't get dealt with any quicker than anybody else. It fits the criteria based on hierarchy of road. You know, how quick is the traffic on it? Whereabouts on the road is it? And that response is timed out and it's stuck to quite religiously. In terms of the quality of repairs, about 90% of our surface defect repairs are fixed permanently first time. You'll notice this week I've emailed round to all members a copy of our programme for 2018 and 2019. You will see there's vast more amount of proactive work on there that you'll be able to see, and it's broken down by division so you can see what's going on in your own patch. So it's about that responsive nature. It does mean, unfortunately, that we don't always get round to fixing repairs as quickly as we'd like to. However, I think it's better that we do a quality repair, a safe repair that lasts, rather than too much of the old orange bucket stuff going in and a whacker plate over the top. Let's get permanent repairs done first and foremost. We have seen in this last couple of months a surge in reports. There's no denying it. I'm pleased to say we're managing to stay on top of pothole repairs as much as we can, but additional monies from government and elsewhere, hopefully from the lectern shortly, will always be well received.
Thank you. We have Councillor Julie Gilly to Councillor Martin Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Hill, I'm sure you're aware, as many of us are, about the international concern about how plastic is affecting all aspects of our environment. And I wondered if the County Council had additional policies in place, apart from the national strategy, that would help us to reduce this issue.
Thank you. Yes, I'm answering on behalf of Councillor Pole, who his wife has been involved in a minor accident and is stuck. So, dutiful husband as he is, he has dispatched himself off to rescue her. So I'll do my best to answer that question. And obviously, these matters are dealt with the Lincolnshire Waste Partnership, which is a partnership between the County Council and all the 7 collection authorities within Lincolnshire. And I know that the plastic issue, I'm sure it's something they will be looking at. I mean, obviously, a lot of some of the smaller plastics which enter the stream actually hopefully will go into the energy from waste plant, where then that small plastics and those bits of plastic which aren't frankly recyclable can then be at least recycled into electricity and other valuable energy. So I'm sure the Waste Partnership is talking about this. So all I can say is that Councillor Pole will get back to you with what the current plans are of the Lincolnshire Waste Partnership to try and reduce the amount of plastic going into our valuable streams and other environmental areas.
Thank you. Well, Councillor Rob Parker to Councillor Richard Davies.
Last question this morning. In relation to my local community of Carhome, which is round here, the 3 things that bother people the most, and when I go to, for example, the Carhome Community Forum, it's street lighting, 1, you've dealt with that, potholes, 2, you've dealt with that, and the 3rd one is we have 2 primary schools in our area, and between 8:30 and 9 o'clock every morning, no different to anywhere else in the county, it's serious problems. I know that Highways were looking at a CCTV van, but I wonder, in simple terms, if you can give any help, guidance to what can be done in a local area, given that we have reported, a number of reports from PCSOs and the civilian parking enforcement that enforcement is seriously difficult outside schools. In the meantime, can you give to us in Carhome, but also to people in the rest of the county, some thoughts about what you think the local communities can do?
Thank you. It used to be said, didn't it, that if you could address speeding, parking and dog fouling, you'd always get re-elected. And I think parking outside schools has become one of those predominant issues. You're right, we have got a CCTV trial underway at the moment at 6 locations across the county, including here in Lincoln, but across the whole county, that's looking at how do we address some of the enforcement issues in and around school. It goes without saying, but it's important to reiterate that I think the way that parents, and it is parents, park outside schools when they are picking up and dropping off their children is frankly a disgrace. It would seem that the modern view is to try and drive your child into the classroom, ignoring all other children, and likewise, when you come to collect your child, do so in the most selfish of manners. It's disgraceful. And I remember, not ever so recently, but in the last year, visiting with your colleague behind you, a school in his ward, where a member of the emergency service had their drive blocked by somebody who was parking there, whose argument was, well, I'm not going to be here very long. Incredible this behaviour goes on. So in terms of how do we deal with it, the CCTV enforcement is going around and it's looking at how we can enforce the zigzag lines. Because really, as a civilian parking enforcement, we are limited. Despite best efforts, we aren't allowed to randomly drag cars away for no good reason. They refuse to give me a licence to individually ticket people that I don't like the look of. And we have to follow very strict criteria. And it's predominantly yellow lines. So we can't enforce things like moving traffic offences, such as obstruction. We can't enforce, frustratingly, parking on pavements, because by and large, unless there is a restriction in place, then it is legal to do so, despite the fact you may be obstructing the pavement. One of the things I would encourage local members to do is, if you've got specific areas of concern and location, you will have seen some notification in the last few weeks. We've got some money from the underspends from the enforcement process to readdress yellow lines outside schools, so it may be worth having a look at some of the two schools you mentioned. Is there a change we can make to the yellow lines in the area, which we can then enforce upon? We do foot patrols to locations outside schools, and that's problematic because half of the battle actually is sometimes people don't understand what the rules are. For example, you can stop your vehicle on double yellow lines. It's completely legal. You are allowed to get out and have passengers alight at double yellow lines. So often, I think the restrictions we have outside schools aren't suitable. In terms of a bigger fix, we've done some work around engaging with local schools and local communities to say, are there car parks nearby that can be used? I've heard of schemes in some areas of the county where the local pub that doesn't tend to be too busy at around school time allows their car park to be used and the school put on a walking bus. That can work very well. However, the challenge is always around, in particular, I think working parents who don't have the time to allow these longer processes to go on. I think schools writing to parents is very good. The most effective one I've seen is where children themselves, in conjunction with responsible adults, speak to parents who are parking dangerously outside the school. There's something very sobering by being spoken to about a 6-year-old in a high-vis jacket asking whether or not you're trying to hurt them. And I've seen it done, and it's very, very effective. We're very keen to explore particular hotspots. If you've got them in your patch, quite happy to come out and have a look. If there's anything legislative we can do. Other than that, it is about trying to get the parents, and it is the parents by and large, to address their attitude and approach.
Thank you. I understand that Councillor Newton, you wish to add something else.
I wish to make an apology to Councillor Martin Hill. I used an inappropriate word when I called him a windbag. My shorthand is not as good as I thought it was, and I should have said, while he made a wide bag full of compliments to Tony, and so I apologise profusely, Martin.
Thank you for the clarification. Thank you, everyone. We have no further questions, so we'll move on to item number 6, which is the council budget for 2018-19. I plan to deal with this item as outlined in the order of procedures, and I propose that we temporarily amend council procedure rules and have one debate. I shall need a seconder for that.
To second that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll move to the vote. All those in favour? Then that is carried. Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I've been suitably reprimanded already this morning, so I shall. I was going to speak for an hour and 3/4, but whilst we were waiting, my red pen has been sort of crossing whole paragraphs out. So hopefully, I'll make this as a reasonable speed and as possible. So, to all new members who've joined us in May, welcome to your first budget day at Lincolnshire County Council. I hope you're not too disappointed that I won't be posing for photographs with a big red box, but money is a little tight. I also haven't brought my friend Boris the Patterdale, even though his bark is generally worse than his bite. Without a red box or a Boris, I can still perhaps surprise you by turning to The Guardian to begin this speech. Well, even it gets things right occasionally, as the New Year column by economics correspondent Richard Parlington showed. Contrary to, presumably, to editorial guidance, he found a host of reasons to be cheerful about the prospects for the UK economy. They included strong global growth, which is forecast by the IMF to be 3.9% this year and next. That's due largely to the economic policies of President Trump, although obviously The Guardian couldn't bring itself to say so. Global growth is set to increase demand for British exports, already performing strongly as a result of the low pound. The Bank of England, despite its trademark Eeyore approach, also believes inflation has peaked at around 3%. It is now expected to fall closer to wage rises, encouraging consumers who've already defined the doommongers with their spending. The Guardian noted what it calls Britain's long jobs boom, which continued in the September to November quarter, with employment up 415,000 on the previous year. This contrasts strongly with the 500,000 job losses predicted immediately after the Brexit vote. Investment is also being encouraged by record low interest rates, which have started their long return to normality, but still stand at just 0.5%. Looking ahead, the Bank of England has revised its UK growth forecast for the next 2 years to 1%, 1.7% and 1.8%, a far cry from the meltdown predicted by some. Overall, The Guardian saw the UK economy entering 2018 in better health than many would have given credit for. Praise indeed. With all this relentless positivity from The Guardian, I'm now considering cancelling my subscription to the Daily Telegraph. Let's now turn briefly to the most important issue facing the UK, our withdrawal from the EU. As we all know, it's a hugely complex process, and there will have to be give and take on both sides to achieve a fair outcome. That's exactly what we saw before Christmas, when the first phase of negotiations ended with agreement on 3 key issues. I'm particularly pleased that the question of citizens living in other countries, both here and in the EU, is close to being resolved. That will provide certainty for migrants building their lives in Lincolnshire and is to be welcomed. It's also encouraging the government will continue to support our farmers for several years once EU subsidies come to an end. That gives them time to develop a new framework for UK food production and the environment, which is exactly what we need. On a similar issue, I'd welcome clarity from the government about how EU development grants will be replaced after Brexit. I'd argue that current funding should broadly be matched by Whitehall, but devolved to a local level where decision makers know best what's required. As we enter the next phase of Brexit talks, attention is taken to the transition period on the way to a final deal. This will give businesses more time to adjust, but the timescale has to be limited, the terms fair, and the ultimate destination unchanged. As the Prime Minister has made clear, Brexit means Brexit, and that means leaving the single market and the customs union to forge our own future. Anything less would be a betrayal of the will of the British people, including many Lincolnshire residents, whose decision in the referendum must be respected. On the subject of polls, not Eddie polls, the election polls, I was of course disappointed by the outcome of the general election last June, even though the Conservatives remained in office. I was particularly concerned that an honest attempt in the campaign to resolve the adult care funding issue was distorted for political gain. Far from proposing a dementia tax, as others alleged, we were seeking to start a wide-ranging debate around the creation of an integrated healthcare system. As things stand, adult care is both means-tested and significantly underfunded, while NHS services are neither of those things. In other words, adult care remains very much the poor relation, something which is going to have to change in the future. The government now plans to publish a green paper on adult social care this summer, starting that long overdue national debate. Jeremy Hunt has also had adult care formally included within his health portfolio, indicating a determination to align the two more closely. Closer to home, of course, the Conservatives achieved a decisive result in the elections to this council last May. With that strong local support behind us, I believe we're better placed than ever to meet the many challenges ahead. They include achieving a fair financial deal for Lincolnshire, something I'd like to now discuss in more detail. As members know, the local government funding formula has been built up layer upon layer, year after year, after many decades. The result is a system that virtually no one understands, with urban authorities as the clear winners and rural ones as the losers. The formula also fails to recognise the huge cost of providing services in areas like ours, the rurality or the sparsity issues. Last year, we launched our Fair Deal for Lincolnshire campaign, supported by MPs, parish and town councils and the general public. It showed that local councils in Lincolnshire are missing out on £116 million of annual funding compared with the England average of £239 per home. With extra funding like that, we could pay for a new bypass, hospital or major road improvement scheme every single year. And we still have enough to fill 4 times as many potholes, provide all businesses with fibre broadband and freeze council tax. As the campaign gained momentum, we secured a meeting in October with Community Secretary Sajid Javid. He praised us as a well-run authority providing good services despite our historic underfunding. He also accepted that the formula is unfair to rural areas and stressed his personal commitment to reform. Since the autumn, we've stepped up the campaign with strong backing from the County Council's network. Earlier this month, it released its own figures, warning that Shire counties could face a £2.5 billion black hole by 2020. Just days later, Northamptonshire County Council revealed the full extent of its financial crisis, issuing a banning order on all non-statutory spending. On the face of it, they are a very similar upper-tier authority to us, providing service to a very similar population across a large area with just one major conurbation. Thankfully, our financial situation is very different due to our pragmatic approach over many years to achieving savings, maintaining sufficient reserves and setting sensible council tax levels. Elsewhere, Surrey was reported to be facing a £105 million shortfall, a story that made the front pages of many national dailies. As regards to council tax, CCN figures show that residents in county areas are being hit as their underfunded authorities put up rates. The average Band D bill is now £1,662 in county areas, £132 more than the English average, and actually if you look at inner London, we are paying in Lincolnshire approximately twice the council tax that they actually enjoy in those areas, and that is due entirely nearly to extra government funding they receive. Clearly this situation can't continue, and it is time to overhaul the system completely, as the government has recognised. In December it launched its own fair funding review, which is currently out for initial consultation. Even at this early stage, however, the broad outlines of the review are encouraging. For example, it suggests that rurality and projected rather than historic population levels should finally be properly recognised. Pressures around adult care, children's services and flood defences could also be central to funding. All across this chamber, we should all welcome the fact the government has listened to local government concerns and embarked on the process of change. In addition, the review seems to be moving ahead rapidly, with 3 consultation stages taking place this year, looking at need, resource and transition. This strikes me as a sensible approach and raises the prospect of new arrangements being in place as early as 2020. With Brexit taking centre stage in Westminster, it would have been easy for the government to put local authority finance on the back burner. It hasn't chosen that easy option and should be commended for that. Let's now look at the background to our budget proposals today, beginning with the 4-year funding deal we accepted in 2016. That deal currently has another 2 years left to run, and it makes sense to set a budget today for that period. As in previous years, our financial planning in the autumn took account of ongoing reductions in government funding. We also looked at growing service pressures, particularly due to rising demand for adult and children's social care. To meet those challenges, we've decided once again on a balanced approach, protecting priority services but still achieving further savings. We also anticipated raising council tax levels by 1.95% plus 2% for the government's adult care precept, as well as using limited reserves. Then, in the provisional local government finance settlement in December, the government relaxed the rules around council tax. It allowed councils, like ourselves, to increase the general element of the bill by up to 3% without a referendum, effectively a 1% rise on the previous limit. This will generate only about 2.6 million, or 1/5 of our cut in our core funding. So, while welcome, it's far from a panacea. We also learned that our joint bid to take part in the business rate pilot scheme had been accepted, a real feather in the cap for the area. The pilot will enable this council, the district councils and North Lincolnshire Council to retain all the locally generated business rates over the coming year. That could be worth an extra £20 million to the area, including approximately £7.5 million for us, and will put us firmly at the forefront of local government change. Although the funding is on a one-off basis, there's also a possibility it could be extended for a second year. Looking now at the funding in more detail, our main grant, RSG, Revenue Support Grant, will fall by a further another £14 million each of the next 2 years. It will fall by a further £14 million in the next 2 years, and I think that's something we should reflect on. By 2019, we expect it to be just £20 million, compared with £211 million at the start of the decade. That's a drop of 90%. The context of this, as you know, is the gradual move towards a system based largely on locally retained business rates. During our pilot year, local councils receive 100% of this extra income, although in the future, government seems to be looking at 75%. Apart from that target figure, it's not yet clear how the new system would work, although it needs to be fit for purpose and in place by 2020. With our government support reducing year on year and demand rising, we need once again to find savings, and although we'll continue to protect high priority areas. In the past, priorities have included adult and child safeguarding, roads, flood risk management, stronger communities and fire and rescue. In other areas, we intend to find savings of £34 million over the next 2 years, on top of the £290 million already achieved since 2011. Most of the new savings will result from difficult decisions this Council has already taken, showing the importance of facing challenges head-on. In addition to achieving more savings, our proposals will meet unavoidable cost pressures of about £52 million. These are particularly acute in adult care as our population ages and as we fund the national living wage with no extra government support. There's also uncertainty about the long future of the Better Care Fund, an important element of our budget strategy, providing us with £86 million for adult care over the next 2 years. Children's social care is another area where demand has grown rapidly, and extra funding will be allocated as part of our business rate pilot, as well as to highways advanced design work. Elsewhere, home-to-school transport, anticipated staff pay rises, waste disposal charges and general inflation are all contributing to rising costs. To help with these pressures, the final settlement 2 weeks ago awarded us an extra £2.1 million to support sustainable adult care markets in the coming year, plus £1.4 million for rural services. We've also been given an extra £1.7 million from this year's Pothole Action Fund, enough to tackle an extra 30,000 defects on our roads. These extra funds are welcome, but they don't change the bigger picture about long-term funding, which remains difficult. Turning now to the revenue budget, the Council will spend £455 million on services in 2018-19 and just slightly less the following year. Those services will improve the lives of almost every one of Lincolnshire's 736,000 residents, from the very young to the very old. We'll support our young people through children's services, children's centres and schools, and help them with transport. We'll promote economic growth and jobs, maintain and develop our huge road network, and provide for heritage attractions and libraries. At this point, I'm pleased to announce that we have been able to make £9 million available for highways improvements and maintenance in coming years, and that will be for consideration by our own Highways Scrutiny Committee to see how best that money can be most effectively deployed. We'll also support the most vulnerable in our society, especially older people, and enhance public safety through fire and rescue and flood risk management. It's a huge responsibility and one that inevitably has to be funded, which brings me now to our proposed council tax rise. As I've mentioned, the government is allowing local authorities to increase general rates by up to 3%, and we need to take advantage of that. Although it will only add £2.6 million to our base budget, although it will only add 2.6 over the next 12 months, the extra 1% will increase our base budget by that amount for future years indefinitely. To ensure the sustainability of our finances, we're therefore proposing a rise of 2.95% plus the government's additional 2% precept for adult care. The total 4.95% increase would mean an extra £1.12 a week for an average Band D property, or 74p a week for Lincolnshire's many Band A households. Even with this rise, we are still expected to have the third lowest council tax of all 27 English Shire counties. Over the last 7 years, our council tax has gone up by about 10%, while general inflation has been 21%. In other words, our share of the charge has fallen in real terms, confirming this authority's long-term commitment to a low rate. To support the revenue budget, we also plan to use, as in previous years, a sensible proportion of our reserves. Currently, we have £68.5 million available to help us balancing books, although obviously this money can only be spent once. Our proposal suggests drawing on nearly £36 million, largely from the Financial Volatility Reserve over the next 2 years. This will smooth our path as previous savings take effect and we develop new service delivery models. We'll also continue to keep our general reserve at £15.8 million, or 3.5% of the Council's total budget, the top end of the recommended range. In addition to reserves, we're investing about £8 million of capital receipts each year in projects that generate ongoing revenue savings. That option had been due to end after 2018-19, but the government has sensibly extended it for another 3 years, and it's right to make use of it. Turning now to the capital programme itself, the Council has always looked to the future of Lincolnshire, not just its day-to-day needs. With that in mind, we'll continue to invest in major road schemes to keep the county moving and generate economic growth. These will include the vitally important Lincoln Eastern Bypass, where the Council has brought in short-term contractors following the collapse of Carillion. As a result, we've been able to carry on making good progress with the project without getting drawn into the complexities of that company's liquidation. Elsewhere, preparatory work for the second phase of the Grantham Southern Relief Road are getting underway. We're also looking at potential improvements to the Lincolnshire Coastal Highway from the A1 through to Lincoln and Skegness, and future solutions to Boston's highways issues. Away from the roads, we'll continue to renew or replace our fire, gritter and waste transfer fleets. In total, the capital investment in Lincolnshire, including grants and contributions, will be over £323 million over the next 2 years and beyond. In drawing to a close, I'm conscious we haven't just been discussing the next 2 years. the period covered by the budget we're setting today. We've also been scanning the long-term financial horizon after the UK has finally left the EU. Whatever your view of that post-Brexit future, and mine is positive, there's no doubt it will present both challenges and opportunities. As a country, we have to rise to them, just as this Council has had to continue to find solutions to the issues confronting us. Over many years now, as Sajid Javid recognised, we provide good services for the people of Lincolnshire despite being seriously underfunded, and will carry on being a well-run authority in the future, doing our best with the limited resources available to us. Over the next 2 years, the balanced budget we're proposing will set a sensible course for Lincolnshire through to 2020. Beyond that, the government has to play a greater part, and I'm confident that it will. Already it's consulting on a complete overhaul of the formula that has left Shire counties so short-changed for so long. It's also planning a green paper on adult care funding, despite the cynical opportunism that dogged the issue last year. These are both important steps on important issues and grounds for cautious optimism for us all. To borrow the Guardian's unexpected phrase about the economy, there are genuine reasons to be cheerful, despite the many challenges we face. On that upbeat note, Chairman, fellow members, I commend these budget proposals to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hill. Amendment by... Sorry, do I have a seconder for that motion?
Yes, Mr Chairman, I'm happy to second that motion, and I'd like to reserve my right to speak later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rob Parker, you would like to move an amendment to that
Sure
motion?
would. Yep. Page 6, 7 and 8 of the order of proceedings. I'm moving the Labour Group amendment. Turning first to the Conservative budget, I want to congratulate Councillor Hill yet again on making his budget speech, and the budget itself seemed like a good deal for people in Lincolnshire. So that's a particular skill, and I commend you for that. The Guardian quote that you began and ended your speech with talked about the economy soaring far and away out of sight, and it was almost a throwback to the 1950s and Harold Macmillan, you've never had it so good. It wasn't quite like that. But certainly in the area that I represent, and I'm sure the people, councillors, have got the same feeling that the people on the ground, as it were, our citizens, don't seem as though that the economy is doing the right things for them. And that's where I suppose I want to start. You've said that there's many reasons to be cheerful. For some people, there are many reasons not to be cheerful. I'm not going to take apart the budget that you presented line by line, but I just want to make some simple points about where we think the Conservative budget falls short. 2 points. First of all, it's a pay more budget in the sense that council tax is going up by 5%, above the rate of inflation, and certainly above the level of wage and pensions that people can expect to receive in Lincolnshire in the coming year. So if we looked at all of the different sorts of people and their increase in income over the next year and then related it to what they can expect compared to the 5% increase, there will be a difference. Now, that in itself isn't important about the 5% increase because I think there are valid reasons for it. But it's the second part because not only is it a pay more budget, it's a get less budget. Because people are paying more council tax, but their services are not going up correspondingly, so they're not seeing any benefits. And in fact, they're seeing in some areas reductions. The readiness for school budget, just as one example, has been cut by nearly £200,000. That money could have been recycled back into education to do some of the things that we're talking about. Turning to the Labour Group budget, it's got 3 elements, and I just want to deal with them. Social mobility amongst children and young people. That follows the Social Mobility Commission report, which we discussed in the council meeting in December. Secondly, the question of what should we be doing about people who have got a financial disadvantage and supporting the Citizens Advice Bureau. And thirdly, dealing with the question of the need for a park and ride service in Lincoln. If we look at the Social Mobility Commission's report, it identified that in certain key areas, young people between the ages of 3 and 18 had different outcomes in different parts of the county. And that essentially is what is social mobility. But in some parts of Lincolnshire, we see examples where we can see better performance in some parts than in others in relation to particularly free school meals and the way that some areas are able to satisfy educational requirements at a different level. So I've been putting forward through discussions with the director, how could we do something about it? And a social mobility task force, which would be a time-limited group of people convened to look at distinct geographical performance. And the point has to be recognised that in some parts of our county, different things happen, and we don't know the reason. And I think that it is important that we address why Boston, for example, in some cases does better than South Holland, and in some cases North Kesteven does better than East Lindsey. And I commend that sort of argument. Sometimes we feel as though when we're moving amendments to a Conservative budget that there's a simple vote taken. At the end of that, the whole thing is forgotten. But I would commend certainly to Councillor Bradwell some of the views that have been expressed in the Social Mobility Commission, or if not views, then certain statistics, can be translated and provide what we might call energy for action. If we look at expanding the small schools project, we know that we have a lot of small schools in Lincolnshire, 80 small schools, and we want to see, for reasons of improving a young person's life chances, extra money put in order to be able to make sure there's financial and geographical issues that shouldn't affect or can be compensated for in relation to children's education. We're looking, for example, also at post-16 and the introduction of a support system for young people not in education, employment and training, where there are different outcomes in different parts of Lincolnshire. And it's that key issue meaning essentially that if you look at the Social Mobility Commission's report, you'll see as a local councillor in South Holland, as an example, that particular district area is not doing as well in some respects as other parts of Lincolnshire. And by contrast, if you're an East Lindsey councillor representing an area in East Lindsey, that in some respects the young people there are not doing as well as in Boston in some respects. And it's about, I think, all of us engaging in our local communities and showing why. There is a point to this, and it goes back actually I want to link something that Councillor Davies did when he wrote out to people a few months ago and said, you know, it takes a long time to get a project off the ground. You know, as a minimum, a decent project takes between 5 and 10 years from idea to realisation, from conception to delivery. And that's true about highway schemes. Very true. And the same applies to the way that we educate our young people. Investment at 3 and 5 and 7 and 9 and 11 and 15 produces something at 18, when we could actually say that that person leaves the educational world of Lincolnshire and goes on to perhaps university or an alternative outcome. But it's taken 15 years from 3 to 18 to get to that point. And that's no different in a sense to the way that we look at highway schemes. Now, you can see the correlation, can't you? That the investment has got to be done early in order for it to, and continued repeatedly through each stage of development. And that's particularly important for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. So there is a link when we're talking about, for example, the Conservative budget and investment in highway schemes, that the same investment is in our social capital, not just our highways capital or economic capital. And that's why we're particularly concerned that we want to try to encourage thinking about that through this budget presentation, following on from our Social Mobility Commission motion at the last council meeting. Turning now to the support for the Citizens Advice Bureau, 480,000. Again, just going back in time, it does seem as though, having quoted Harold Macmillan, and you've never had it so good in the 1950s, I worked for the Department of Health and Social Security in London in the headquarters office in the 1980s. And as Michael Caine has said, not a lot of people know this, but Dr. Gerard Vaughan was Minister for Consumer Affairs in 1983, and I was in the government department at that particular time, and he said that he intended to cut the CAB budget by a half, government funding. And one very senior civil servant said, he'll not last. And he didn't. He was out within 2 months because the Tory shires and the MPs just rebelled. And this is the 80s. And yes, he went because he'd threatened the CAB. And we think, I can't look back and think about Conservatives with a social conscience. Right, look what they did. They actually encouraged the Prime Minister of the day, I'm sure you know who that was in the 1980s, for Dr. Gerard Vaughan to go because he dared to threaten the Citizens Advice Bureau funding. Here we are in Lincolnshire now cutting £480,000 from a budget, which is about, key two words, income maximisation. It's about making sure that people who are on state benefits or entitled to state benefits get their income maximised. Now, that doesn't seem an unreasonable service to provide for a county council like Lincolnshire. But no, we've decided to end it. We're arguing that that is an important public service which we ought to be supporting, and we ought to follow along the lines that were indicated by the Conservative government of the 1980s. Less than £500,000 does not, in the scheme of things, seem a lot of money to invest in a group of people who are the most disadvantaged. And we're back to this question of social mobility, to helping people to get the right amount of state benefit, not anything more than they're not entitled to, but the right amount of state benefit in order for them to live as decent a life as they can. And then finally, we turn to our budget and park and ride in Lincoln. And this is a perennial, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure that Richard Davis and before Richard William Webb remember moving this very same motion probably 8-10 years ago. And Councillor Webb told me and told the Labour group at the time, we'll have to wait until the outcome of the Lincoln Eastern Relief Road has been in place for a couple of years, say 2017-18, he said. Okay, that didn't quite happen in the timescale concerned, but his argument at the time was that that somehow the Lincoln Eastern Relief Road would take away a lot of traffic that wouldn't necessarily travel through Lincoln. I was sceptical about it, about the need for delay. I was sceptical about whether or not that particular scheme would be delivered by 2017. I'm talking about completed. So we're back to it. You know, the point about it is that we look about for reference points, don't we? And Councillor Hill, for example, made the reference point with Northamptonshire. I'm making the reference point as somebody who was born in Lincoln, who's lived in Lincolnshire all my life, and most of it in Lincoln. And the point is that traffic congestion is getting worse and worse and worse. Okay, how do we compare ourselves? Well, the university actually uses the branding of Lincoln as one of the world's great small cities. Okay, cathedral, and I thought that I would make a contrast with the other small cathedral cities, including Norwich. What about park and ride? Well, as I've shown, and I thought it was worthwhile showing, Norwich has got 6 sites, York's got 6 sites, Salisbury 5, Chester, Exeter and Winchester 4 sites each, Canterbury and Durham 3 sites. Okay, the point being that there is a need for park and ride. Anybody who comes into the council, say on a Friday morning like you have done, coming along Carhome Road, or leaving Carhome Road, for example, at 4:30 to 5 o'clock any night of the week, except for half-term, knows there is a serious problem. Okay, what are we doing about it? Well, it's in the Lincoln Transport Plan, has been for some time as one of the aims and objectives. We're reminding this Conservative Council that it's about time it was delivered, and we're saying how much it could cost, and I'm sure that you would agree that there would be huge benefits for Lincoln, both in terms of the environment, through reduction in congestion, and basic quality of life for that scheme to go ahead. So, to sum up, there are 3 areas that we're looking at for extra spending to justify the 5% increase so that people feel as though they're gaining something out of the extra increases. The first one is social mobility. The second one social mobility being about helping different parts of Lincolnshire to benefit from the expertise that we have in our Education and Children's Service Department, Citizens Advice Bureau to ensure that those people who need help the most in maximising their income get it. I can think of plenty of people outside of the people on state benefits who want to make their income maximised and go to lawyers and accountants, and that is a job done. We think the same sort of advice ought to be available to people on income support or eligible for income support. And finally, park and ride. I'm pleased personally to be moving this budget on behalf of the Labour Group and look for support.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. Do we have a second for your amendment? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dodds. Right, I now invite other...
Could I speak now? Or?
Oh, sorry. Absolutely.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that today is fundamentally about what we feel is of value to us in Lincolnshire. And for me, it begs the question is what has happened over the last few years because of the cuts that we've seen under successive Conservative governments. And to start with, I want to kind of just raise our vision a little bit to that national picture. Nowhere is the impact of austerity being felt more keenly than in children's services. A recent LGA report from August 2017 identified that in 2015 to 16, spend had surpassed children's social care budgets by 650 million nationally. That's eye-watering. By 2020, in the same report, they predict a £2 billion gap in children's services a £2 billion gap in children's services costs for social care. The government's scheme about using council tax to plug these kind of spending gaps will never work, as councils in affluent areas with the least cost pressures on those services and relatively little social deprivation are left in a stronger position to raise money. On a national level, this government has created a postcode lottery in regards to the protection of our most valuable assets, our children. Unlike Councillor Hill, I don't believe you can ever justify not being able to keep children safely at home. And these cost pressures in children's social care and in the rise in looked after children show that at the moment we are failing as a country to do just that. In our very own budget papers, we read, the national increase in looked after children is currently considered by the sector to be 8%. Our own budget papers include the explanations for this, and they're listed as austerity, the complexities and pressures of family life, including substance misuse, mental health and domestic abuse. Nothing is more harmful morally and nothing is more costly financially than failing to protect our children and failing to promote social mobility. No one would argue that the well-being of children should not be our number one priority. And in every financial and emotional sense, they are our ultimate invest-to-save project, or they should be. This is what our alternative budget seeks to do. This is an invest-to-save project into Lincolnshire children because every child is needs and every child is equally deserving of the best start in life and beyond that. Every child still matters. And this not just makes moral sense, it makes financial sense because spending and investing on those young people now stops quantities of emergency spend later down the line. It's not just a case of direct funding to social care. Many of the services that really make a difference in terms of prevention and support have been slashed over the years. And it's in the slashing of those services that has done so much harm to families. And again, the rise in the number of children in social care points to that very strongly. In this alternative budget, we are seeking to restore the money that we are threatening to take away from the CAB for their income maximisation project. Back in 2011 to 2012, figures show that for every £1 spent on that scheme in Lincolnshire, the project secured £13.51 for families who were receiving that support. So £1 spent resulted in £13.51 back into those families' coffers. Last year, The income maximisation project in South Lincolnshire helped support 829 families with an aggregate debt of £10.37 million. It generated a staggering £2.42 million worth of benefits back into families. We can't afford to lose this kind of project and this kind of scheme. In our business plan, this council repeatedly states that we want to advance equality of opportunity. Can I ask that if everyone here really means that, they support these amendments? We are wanting to invest to save, not in projects, not in buildings, but in children and young people. And we want to invest in those children, particularly in the most underperforming areas in Lincolnshire, to give them the strongest start possible. We've not just plucked rabbits out of the hat from here. These projects all have firm evidence bases. The Social Mobility Task Force approach is being worked and working really well in Devon and Lambeth. We can't afford not to support our small rural schools. They face immense challenges in terms of finance, recruitment and curriculum delivery, and yet are vital for the community well-being and sense of cohesion in so many of our communities. In many ways, these are not new policies. The programme that we are suggesting in terms of post-16 training for young people not in education, employment and trading can be seen as a restoration of what we used to do before budgets got tight. If it was important to do then, it's still important to do now. Austerity stops spending, but it does nothing to prevent need. That need then escalates, and all it does is result in more pressure and more expense later down the line. So this is an opportunity to make a statement to all of the children in Lincolnshire that we support them, that we're behind them, that we know that they are our most valuable assets. Members, please invest to save. Invest to save in our children and our young people, because our future and their future cannot afford the cost of allowing them to fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dodds. I now invite other councillors wishing to speak to indicate by pressing their buttons. And first one is Councillor Chris Brewis.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll be mostly brief. And as you know, because you've been there, I represent the most distant resident in this county, who is only about 7 miles in a straight line from King's Lynn. But having said that, I thought it was amazing in the summer when, to get the DUP support, the government threw £2 billion at Northern Ireland. I waited for the next voice to say, we'll throw Lincolnshire £1 billion to teach rural shires and everybody else in the cities how to manage on a very lean budget, but we still wait for that. I should be supporting the budget that Martin Hill has proposed for one reason. I don't really believe deep down, long term, waiting for 2020, that we have a great deal of alternative. But I would make one particular plea, and the one thing that really strikes a chord with me in what's proposed here is, and we need to keep at the top of our priorities, is as soon as we do get easier times and better, fairer funding, that we do restore CAB funding, because CAB is good value for money, and we still believe there's £100 million unclaimed by people, which they were entitled to in this county, and they have a moral duty to claim, and CAB are very good at doing that. And I, as you know, have the first video link CAB in the country in my own division, and I think CAB do a wonderful job, and we need to have that fairly well in our priorities when times, as we hope, get a bit easier. But I shall be supporting the budget, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mark Whittington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said earlier on, I'm very happy to second the Conservative group budget, the outline of which was demonstrated by Councillor Hill in his address. I mean, the situation hasn't really changed a great deal. You know, we still face significant reductions in government funding. We've got increasing cost pressures due to demography, unit cost increase across our demand-led services, so that's adults, social care, children's services, waste. You know, it's been fully laid out. And there's a very, very real financial challenge facing this council, not just over the 2 years of this budget, but in the years to come after that, until we know the outcome of the fair funding review and what the new local government finance settlement is likely to look like from 21-22 onwards. But as part of the budget setting process, all areas of council expenditure have been looked at quite in depth by the county finance teams. And actually, they do have some very, very detailed financial models, especially around things like adult, social care and children's services, which do cost in all the demography, increases, forecast increases in demand, increases in unit costs, and set the budgets accordingly. And it's interesting that every year, children's services and adult services don't overspend. And the reason they don't overspend is because the budgets were set properly in the first place. So this idea that there's some kind of great unmet demand out there that the Labour group would have us believe, I believe is complete and utter nonsense. The budgets are adequate, and considerable, I would give considerable praise to our finance teams for the work they do. I've reviewed some of these models myself, and I've been mightily impressed at the level of detail they actually go into. You know, we're in a really good position in this county when compared, and as Councillor Hill referred to, places like Northamptonshire and Surrey. And the reason why we are here in a relatively decent position is because of the sound of prudent financial management that this council has followed over a number of years. It comes back to the basic message: you can't spend what you haven't got. It's as simple and straightforward as that. Labour can deny that all they want to with their alternative budget. It's a reality. You can't spend what you haven't got. You know, but within this budget, we have been able to do some really important things. 2 years ago, there was a threat to the budget for children's centres and also for rural bus subsidies. At that time, we had some 2-year funding that came through the Rural Services Grant, and we were able to protect those budgets for a further 2 years. We're in a great position now, through sound and prudent financial management, to be able to further protect those key budgets for a further 2 years. These were 2 of the top 3 items that when we had the public consultation 2 years ago, the public identified as being really useful. So we've been able to actually protect those because we are sound and prudent in our financial management. Going on then to another item that was pretty top of that list was the state of the roads and highways. And again, because we've benefited from some one-off benefits to our funding this year, we've been able to put an extra £9 million into highways, 3.3 million of which comes from the Conservative amendment. So again, that is addressing what the public of Lincolnshire actually told us they actually wanted to see. Let's now have a quick look at what Labour are proposing to do. An extra £5.5 million worth of revenue expenditure in 2018-19 and a further £6 million in 1920, because there's an extra £600,000 that will need to go in because there'll be a 600k increase in the interest that we have to pay if we go with a park and ride scheme. Now, this £5.5 million and then £6 million isn't just for 1 year, it's recurrent, it's every year. The impact is ongoing. So let's, address this issue. Over the 2 years of this budget, that will cost an extra £11.5 million. We already know that as a result of our Conservative budget, our financial volatility reserves at the end of this 2 years will be £32 million. If we then take off the best part of another £12 million from the proposals the Labour group are proposing, we'll be left with £20 million in volatility reserve. We'll wipe out a third of our financial volatility reserve if we follow the Labour group amendment. And then we will go into financial year 2021, still a year before we know what the new government funding review is going to be, with only £20 million, at a time when we know we've got increases in demography coming our way, we know unit costs are going to go away, At that point, I asked the Labour group, what services would you then cut if you were in power? You know, because potentially, without this £12 million that you're proposing to spend, we would have to make some really serious cuts to our existing services, our existing elderly people who rely upon the care we provide, and children's. So let's not have any nonsense about it's only the Labour Party, the Conservatives and social conscience. We have a social conscience, and the reason we are able to deliver a budget that has a social conscience at its very heart is because of sound and prudent financial management that this council has adopted over the last few years, and not the financial irresponsibility that the Labour group are proposing.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marianne Overton.
Thank you, Chairman. Have I got 3 minutes, is it? Right, okay, thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to say that I have heard a lot of useful things today. I'm very pleased to see that the extra funding for potholes is so important, and also some of the other things that are in there, but there are some major issues with this as well. I am concerned about some of the rhetoric, which I think in a way is a shame, because we are all trying to do our very best for our residents in Lincolnshire, and I don't think there's a need for any of the other kind of approach. I'm pleased to see some recognition from the work of myself and also from the County Council Network and the Local Government Association in supporting rural councils, shire councils in particular, who are clearly shortchanged. And I do believe that we have a breakthrough here. I would like to see a lot more, absolutely. It's only some of what was taken away being returned. But I think we have made great success here, and the meetings that I've had with ministers I felt were positive. Also, I think it's really important to say that if we have a clear commitment to austerity, if that was a strong speech rather made, demonstrating a commitment to austerity and how we can manage with very little. But then, if you take that view, how can you go and say, yet we deserve more? We do deserve more. You've only got to go a very short distance on the rural roads. It's particularly in my area at the moment since the A17 was shut, and we had all of that traffic going through our tiny lanes. Can you imagine these huge lorries passing on single-track lanes? It's just outrageous, and the cost of the repair of that is going to be huge. And so we will certainly need all of that funding. I don't see the potholes properly repaired. Some of them are no longer repaired in time. They used to be. They used to be within the 28 days in the rural areas in the beginning. They're not now, and nor are they repaired properly. They need to be actually dug out and make a proper square and actually put the material in properly so that they last more than they do. Some of them are coming out extremely quickly. The Lifeline Fund, I'm really concerned about. I know there's been a response and an explanation for that. The costs are up. But actually what we're saying is that people who have these needs must now pay for it themselves. So we're moving away from a system where people who have disabilities or particular needs felt they were supported by the council. And it's much more going towards paying for what it costs. And I recognise the pressures on the budget, but you can imagine. And I had an individual come to me yesterday, in fact, absolutely distraught because of this extra bill. And for her, it was the last straw. For some of these people, particularly if they've got elderly, difficult people that they're looking after and are struggling with, that is an extremely difficult situation. And then they get these extra bills dumped on without notice, as they felt. This is what they said to me. That's why it is such a concern for our residents.
Councillor Overton, would you mind
rounding up? Thank you, absolutely I will. The CAB, another clear issue which I won't go into, but are we doing well? We are coping, and we do have good financial management, but when you think we're selling off assets, we are using reserves. The phrase, reality is that we can't spend what we don't make.
Councillor Overton, can I ask you to finish, please?
So in the last sentence, we're selling off assets, we're charging more and giving less. Thank you.
Thank you.
In accordance with page 11 and paragraph 3 A in relation to Councillor Whittingham's speech. It'll be very brief. Is it going to be? Yes, it's going to be brief. Be very brief. Councillor Whittington was critical of the Labour budget and the ongoing costs. I'd like members to turn to the page 5, which has in red a number of developments that took place after Labour moved its budget, had discussions with the finance officer. So we can see in red. If we then turn over, we can see on page 6, just ahead of the Labour motion and just above the name of motion to be seconded by Councillor Whittington, that these proposals reduce the funding available to assist in balancing future budgets from the financial volatility reserves to 43.970 million. Okay? 43.970. If we'd now like to turn over to page 8, we will see that at the bottom of the page, under Labour's budget, the funding available to balance future budgets from the financial volatility reserve will be 46.330 million, which is nearly £3 million more. Over 2 years is £6 million. I just want to bring that to the attention of the Council, that the figures that were being quoted and the shortfall is not as imagined.
Thank you, Councillor Parker. Councillor Kev Clark.
Thank you, Chairman. Speaking in favour of the Labour amendment, one of the elements of the amendment is the Lincoln Park and Ride. Now, you'll all know the coverage Lincoln's received over the traffic congestion in Lincoln. So it's not a made-up thing, you know. I think we're third worst in the whole of England. The East West Link, as I said before, is a wonderful road. When you're on it, it's just getting there to start off with, and when you're on it, you get off it, you're in traffic congestion. However, you know, 8 years we waited, and it's a shame he's not here, because there is light at the end of the tunnel. When the latest Richard Davies show, formerly known as Look North, when he was on that, the executive member stated, we need to get people out of cars. This, I presume, is a reference to the Park and Ride in Lincoln. So it seems after 8 years we have made some progress, but I hope the people of Lincolnshire, because that's who you're on about, the people of Lincolnshire coming into Lincoln, don't have to wait another 8 years for Park and Ride.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Julie Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Whilst I'd like to agree with Councillor Hill about the rosy picture he paints about the economy, can I just make the point that the increases in income are not shared equally by everyone in today's society? And I really want to link this with the issue of social mobility. As a teacher for 30 years, I taught mainly the 16 to 18 age range, and I'm really speaking in favour of the Labour amendments about the transition post-16 education, because what I actually saw, which I think still exists today, is a very elitist post-16 education, with A-levels always being seen as the preferred choice and vocational education qualifications being the second choice. In fact, only this week, Theresa May mentioned that she would like to see parity between these two qualifications. I also had, as I was head of department, I also had some opportunity to teach Year 7, which was the first year, which had made a transition from primary school to secondary school, and basically they were already turned off education, I would say, in the second term. And the primary reason for that was because of the restricted curriculum imposed by the national curriculum in 1988. So I would go further in saying that not only do we really need to look, and I know it's national government's responsibility, at our post-16 education, because we've got a shortage of plumbers, etc., etc. When we leave, and all the Polish plumbers, etc., go back to their home countries, we will really realise that we have a massive shortage in those areas. So I think it's not just a question of looking at post-16 education. I think you should be looking, as Councillor Parker said, about various stages in education at 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, and then post-16, because you don't suddenly change at post-16. Your diet of education begins when you go to school. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tricia Bradwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, listening to a lot of things from across the other side, and actually I don't really know where you've been since 2010, because actually the local authority does not have the same responsibilities for education that it did have. I know you're wanting to put additional funding in, but actually, as you know, academies are funded, they get their own school improvement grants, and you know, we are only able to go into our maintained schools. So it is slightly a different picture to what you paint. What I would say is that we as a local authority work with all our schools, academies and free schools and that, and actually we've got a very, very successful learning partnership alliance, which is made up of all our schools. All our schools are signed up to that alliance, and that is a sector-led approach on school improvement. That is actually deemed by DFE to be something that the way that they want to see things, and our officers go all across the country, and actually they've been abroad to actually talk about that sector-led approach, that the sector help each other to improve. And I agree that we have got pockets and we have got areas of deprivation, but they're not new areas of deprivation. We know about those areas of deprivation, and we have actually been successful in getting £750,000 from government to actually work with Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 in maths, literacy and communication skills. I do agree that we all the time we think we need to do more, but actually we've got the LEP doing more with post-16, with skills and employment, and they're investing £12 million into a project which includes people who are not in education and employment. So there is a whole raft of things that's going on in the county and being targeted at areas, and I do believe those pilots, we need to see how they go and let the schools and let the sector do that for us. We haven't got a massive area within school improvement. We don't have the staff anymore. We've only probably got 3 or 4 staff in school improvement. So, you know, we do rely on working with the sector. I have to agree with disagree with Councillor Dodds, and I think she actually should retract that very misleading statement that she said that children aren't protected and aren't safe in Lincolnshire, because they are. Yes, you did, because I've wrote it down. Children are protected in Lincolnshire. They're safe in Lincolnshire. And so, therefore, that was misleading to say that they aren't. And so I disagree, and I won't be supporting the alternative budget. I think we're actually doing very well, considering we have had reduced budgets, but actually schools, through the fairer funding, are going to get £16 million this year extra into their budget. They haven't had the cuts that we've had, and there is money available for them to do things. So I actually think the picture isn't dire, like you say. We have got work to do in East Lindsey, South Holland and Boston, and that's where these pilots will be going. So I don't think the world is falling apart in education. I think we do very well, but I will admit we have more work to do and will be doing it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sue Woolley.
Thank you, Chairman. CAB, let's make no bones about it, CAB is highly regarded. And it's for that very reason that this Conservative budget has decided to continue funding CAB. It is a good news story. We are putting in a significant amount of money. Income maximisation, however, will not end. It might be that CAB no longer to do it in the same vein, but it's for this very reason why income maximisation will not end in Lincolnshire. Age UK provide income maximisation schemes and advice. Lincolnshire Home Improvement Agency provide income maximisation advice. Lincolnshire Community Foundation provide income maximisation. Can you get where I'm going with this? There are a number of and I can go on, there are other organisations in Lincolnshire who provide income maximisation advice. One of those is actually funded by the County Council, P3. Specifically, P3 looks after people who are at risk of becoming homeless. Between July last year and January, of the 1,893 clients that they saw, over 1,158 of those were provided with, guess what, income maximisation advice. So the point that I'm making is that that area of work appears to be exceedingly well covered, and CAB will continue to be funded by this County Council.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Matt Bowles.
Thank you, Chairman. I suppose one of the probably only benefits about sitting here as a one-man band is that I don't really have to engage in the political point scoring and name-calling and all that kind of nonsense. I can just stand here and represent the people of Gainsborough and what they're telling me on a daily, weekly basis. So that's what I'm going to do in terms of this budget. First of all, the ever-favourite topic of street lighting and grass cutting is what people tell me every day. And I can't support a budget that does not reinstate those that funding to those policies, as the people of Gainsborough would not expect me to do, because that is all they talk to me about. In the same breath, I think the people of Gainsborough are realistic. They're not asking for that to be fully refunded to the level it was, but somewhere in between, I think, is a sensible compromise and what the people of Gainsborough are looking for. The second part, again, is CAB. Has been discussed many times, so I won't really go into too much detail. Other than, again, I've been contacted by many local residents, many volunteers, many workers at the CAB in Gainsborough, and if this is voted through, a full-time member of staff will be lost at CAB in Gainsborough, who provides advice to the most vulnerable members of our community, usually the elderly, the disabled. You know, it provides help completing forms for ESA, Universal Credit, PIP.
Is misleading this council. The core funding, as Councillor Woolley has clearly explained, the core funding we give to CAB will continue, so there should be no redundancies due to any reduction in core funding by this council, because there is none. And what Councillor Bowles just described was core activity of the CAB.
Thank you for that point, Councillor.
And is part of the £338,000 that would be cut as part of the income maximisation problem. That is a full-time employee at Gainsborough CAB. That is what they've told me. Well, that's what I'm saying now.
Councillor, can I remind you to keep your points that this council can have a direct effect with, rather than items that are outside our control?
I'm saying that funding that is going to be cut as part of this budget is going to lose a full-time member of staff who helps the most vulnerable in our community. So for that reason, I personally will be on this occasion supporting the Labour amendment, as it represents what the people who I represent are telling me. That's it, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Paul Key.
Thank you, Chair. Most of what I was going to say has probably already been said, but I do totally agree with what Matt's just said and the way the people in Gainsborough are feeling. A bit earlier on when the budget was mentioned, and we said if we got the 116 million, we'd be all right to do this, and this. No mention of the street lighting being reinstated on that. No mention of the grass verges being cut. They seem to go on by the wayside. Also, I have to agree a lot with what Councillor Overton has said, and when she was saying, different things. And I think we're all supposedly sitting in this chamber to make decisions for the public. Well, we all know there's one decision will be made here, and that will be made by 58 Conservatives. And that's not me getting rhetoric about Conservatives, that's the simple fact. But the other fact on these sort of things is the people out there, I'll phrase this very carefully, I think. People and austerity, right, they've had enough, right? You can see it in where I come from and you can see it elsewhere. And I fear that if we're not careful, we will have anarchy on our streets. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tony Bridges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that Councillor Mrs. Killy is back because I thought she'd gone looking for a foreign plumber, a Polish plumber. I thought you'd gone looking for a Polish plumber. As regards the CAB, we've already heard from Councillor Sue Woolley, Mr. Chairman, that we do contribute. And I took the opportunity to go onto the citizensadvice.org.uk just a few minutes ago. And I saw that the Citizens Advice is well placed to manage its liabilities as they fall due and the business risk we face. The position is supported by a strong cash flow, sufficient reserves, good relationships with our key funders and a proven ability to secure new services. We therefore have a reasonable expectation that we have sufficient resources to continue in operational existence for the foreseeable future. Signed, Sir David Varney, Chair of Trustees. I rest my case.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Robin Renshaw.
Thank you, Chairman. I shan't go into such a long one this time. Whilst I generally support the Missing Millions campaign for Lincolnshire, it is disingenuous of the ruling group to ask for it when the Tory government for the last 5 years has donated 8.6 billion, I repeat, 8.6 billion pound to high-earning taxpayers, each of whom has benefited from £100,000 year on year. And for those 5 years, that equates to £500,000. I bet many Lincolnshire taxpayers would think that Christmas has come early. They managed to earn £100,000 per annum, let alone the million of so pounds they would have got to receive to produce that benefit. I would support the park and ride proposals because they are sound. Lincoln as a tourist destination falls disgracefully short of park and ride services compared to other major cathedral and tourist cities. As Netlham Fields on the Lincoln Edge development grows with the housing development, there will be less capacity for the current service to be sustainable, as the current parking site will be required by the site owners. We certainly should be planning for this now. And finally, we were talking about the congestion and the highways thing. I think it's about time we had a better dialogue with Highways England, because a lot of smaller schemes that could help the congestion, and that's where the link is with the congestion in Lincoln that many councillors across the piece have been complaining about. We can do small things which help the traffic flow. And I'll give an example of the Bunkers Hill scheme. That's a large scheme, but there's schemes that cost a fraction of that would help the traffic flow and ease the congestion in Lincoln. But Park and Ride needs to be the major player in that game. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Alison Austin.
Thank you, Chairman. I've not pre-prepared this, so I'm sorry if I'm not as coherent as I might be. Listening, first of all, to the Labour amendment, I don't think there's any of us who wouldn't acknowledge the role that CAB does, but I think we have to look to funding where there are not other layers of government also putting their money. And I don't think this is the right forum to be getting changes to national policies. I don't do party politics, I think most of you know. I just try to look rationally at things. I think I'm probably the only person from Boston who's never actually asked for a bypass for Boston in the 5 years I've been on this council. I may have mentioned it, but I've never asked for it. I do question a sense of geography, perhaps, that a coastal highway goes to Lincoln. My idea of coastal isn't over there. However, I think, more seriously, we have to use our money where it benefits most people, and this rurality issue is the thing that is so important. We can't just concentrate on the largest conurbation, nor for that matter the next largest conurbation, which is Boston. But we have to look to use our money so that also, at the same time as helping many people as possible, it is paving the way for developing, letting the economy of our area flourish. And whilst we're meeting needs of people as much as possible, we also have to look to the future. Thank you. Oh. I won't be supporting the Labour amendment. I will be voting for this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. We have no more councillors indicating that they wish to join in the debate, so I'm going to ask Councillor Martin Hill if he'd like to respond.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I'll start my first response to Councillor Renshaw, and it's so pleased to see you there looking fighting fit, Robin, and your practical pearls of wisdom. It doesn't get better than that, because what I would say to his comment... Yes, it is true that corporation tax... yes. Your face nicely matches your shirt at the moment, so... it is true that corporation tax and higher rates of income tax have been reduced, but what a lot of Labour politicians don't seem to understand is that has increased more income. They are paying more tax into the Chancellor's coffers than before. So that has got to be a good thing. So if you have come up with a strategy where people pay more tax, the richer people and the richer corporations, they are paying more, surely that's a good thing. And I can't see why that should really upset anybody unless they really just don't like some people being better off than others. So I have to disagree with him on that point. I think there was a mention also made about a cut of 400,000 to children's services. That is not a cut. That is merely by being a sensible recommissioning. We have saved, and children's services have saved, £400,000 by getting someone to deliver the same service and reducing the funding. And that's one of the secrets why across this council, by being a better commissioner, we have been able to save money and protect frontline services. I think Councillor Parker is correct. His opening gambit was pay more budget and get less budget. Yes, that's right. We are getting reduced income from government and we're facing increased demand. So that exactly is the case, which is why it's so important that we continue to support the fair funding campaign so locally we can benefit, but also we as local government also make sure that this green paper on funding of adult care and NHS is seen through to a sensible conclusion. And there is a risk in the budget, as I mentioned in my speech, that the Better Care Fund, we are quite reliant on it now, and we need to make sure that there is no commitment at the moment what will continue after the next few years. So there is a risk at the end of the tunnel there, and I think we've all got our work cut out to make sure that does work. I think citizen advice has been clearly delivered. We are delivering that. That's why we do support it. And I think you've had a clear explanation on that. The lifeline, and I think that was, again, an issue where we are still going to support the service and we'll support people who we want them to use this. It is sometimes forgotten that some of the money that used to pay this will come from personal allowances which people have got. But even if that was not the case, I would still maintain paying £1 or so a week is very good value for money, not only for the people staying in their homes, but for their relatives, to have the secure knowledge that they know their parent or their relative who has needs is safe at home, and there is an expensive service out there where resources or family can be mobilised at short notice to bring support. So I would think that is, even at the percentages sound a lot, but we are talking 36p a week to over £1, which is, I would argue, is not an unreasonable amount of money to pay extra. I mean, I think I would support Councillor Whittington. I know Councillor Parker wanted to make a point about the sums of money, but I thought Councillor Whittington was exactly right. The problem with the Labour amendment is most of that money, including the bypass, and of course that's £1 million revenue extra funding, about the park and ride. The issue is, although we are spending more money on highways, which I think everybody would agree is what the public expect us to do at this particular moment, that is not recurrent money, that is one-off money and grants we've got from the government. The Labour amendment is money which will go into the base budget and which will mean we will hit the buffers, the financial buffers, that much faster. And I would say in previous years, if we'd agreed with previous motions to actually put more money into revenue budget, we wouldn't have any reserve, financial volatility reserve left now, and we will be faced with a budget having to make some really difficult decisions back to some of those things about children's centres, reducing the gritting of the roads, reducing bus subsidies. We are quite unusual now in a rural county area. We still do subsidise bus services. Many of our contemporary councils don't do it at all. They've just stopped doing it. And I think we should be proud of the fact that in spite of our funding challenges, we are still able to do that, but it will require a sensible continuation of funding as we've got. Street lights has been mentioned. All I would say to those who have mentioned it, there's nothing in the Labour motion, I can see amendments about street lights at all, unless I'm mistaken. So you still wouldn't do you any good in terms of putting in that budget. We are doing the consultation, as you were aware, but we have made it clear that we are difficult choices here. That's what we're elected to do, to make difficult choices, sometimes nice choices, on behalf of the people that send us here. So I would say to you, well, go to your public. Would they rather we didn't do the potholes and actually put street lights on at night in some areas, reinstated them? Ask them that question and see what answer you get. I'm pretty confident I know what the answer will be. People understand we have a massive problem with the length of our roads, but that's the choices we have to make. And we're not saying street lights at night are bad, although some people would say that. What we're saying is these are some of the choices we have to make. I think that's all I've got to say on that. So thank you for a very, and I don't really believe, I don't accept your remarks, Councillor Bowles, about petty point scoring and party political. I think some of us remember how it used to be here. I think that's been a good budget debate, and I compliment Councillor Parker as usual on his very clear amendment. So we're very clear, and I think the standard of debate here has been very good today. And obviously, I will now like to move the motion as printed on page 5 and 6 of which is the Conservative proposal, and obviously beyond that, there will be the amendment proposed by the Labour Group, which we will now go to vote for. And one of the final jobs of our current Chief Executive is to do the exciting job of doing the recorded vote, something which I know he looks forward to every single year. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hill. We move on to the recorded vote on the Labour Group amendment.
Thank you, Chairman. You are indeed now voting on the Labour amendment. I'll read out the name of each member. With those voting for, say yes. Those voting against, say no. And those abstaining, say abstain. Councillor Adams. No. Councillor Aaron. No. Councillor Ashton. No. Councillor Alison Austin. No. Councillor Bowles. Yes. Councillor Mrs Bowkett. No. Councillor Mrs Bradwell. No. Councillor Brailsford. No. Councillor Brewis. We'll go back on that one. Councillor Brewis? No. Councillor Bridges? No. Councillor Mrs Brockway? No. Councillor Brooks? No. Councillor Bootroyd? No. Councillor Corey? No. Councillor Clark? Yes. Councillor Mrs Cook? No. Councillor Coupland? No. Councillor Cullen? Yes. Councillor Davey? No. Councillor Davies? No. Councillor Dobson? No. Councillor Dodds? Yes. Councillor Fido? Councillor Fuchs. Councillor Griggs. Councillor Grocott. Councillor Higgs.
No.
Councillor Hill. Councillor Kendrick. Councillor Key. Councillor Mrs Kelly. Councillor Kirk. Councillor Mrs Lawton. Councillor Macy. Councillor Marfleet. Councillor Matthews. Councillor Maughan. Councillor McNally. Councillor Mrs Newton. Councillor Mrs Overton. Councillor Oxby. Councillor Parker. Councillor Pepper. Councillor Mrs Pearson Williams. Councillor Reid. Councillor Renshaw. Councillor Skinner. Councillor Mrs Sneath. Councillor Spencer. Councillor Spratt. Councillor Stokes. Councillor Storer. Councillor Strange. Councillor Strengle. Councillor Mrs Talbot. Councillor Thompson. Councillor Mr Trollope-Bellew. Councillor Turner. Councillor Whittington. Councillor Mrs Woolley. Councillor Mrs Wooten. Councillor Wooten. Councillor Worth. Councillor Young. Is there any member whose name I've not called? Thank you.
Right, we have the results. The yes is 8, the noes are 54, and the abstention is 1. Right, we'll now move over to the Conservative group motion, and once again that will be a recorded vote.
Thank you, Chairman. Voting on the original, the Conservative motion. Councillor Adams. Yes. Councillor Aaron. Yes. Councillor Ashton. Yes. Councillor Mrs Austin. Yes. Councillor Bowles. No. Councillor Mrs Bowkett. Yes. Councillor Mrs Bradwell. Yes. Councillor Brailsford. Yes. Councillor Brewis. Yes. Councillor Bridges. Yes. Councillor Mrs Brockway. Yes. Councillor Brooks. Yes. Councillor Bootroyd. Yes. Councillor Mr Corey. Yes. Councillor Clark. No. Councillor Mrs Cook. Councillor Coupland. Councillor Cullen. No. Councillor Davey. Yes. Councillor Davies. Yes. Councillor Dobson. Yes. Councillor Dodds. No. Councillor Fido. Councillor Fuchs. Yes. Councillor Griggs. Yes. Councillor Grocott. Yes. Councillor Higgs. Yes. Councillor Hill. Yes. Councillor Kendrick. Yes. Councillor Key. No. Councillor Mrs Kelly. No. Councillor Kirk. Yes. Councillor Mrs Lawton. Councillor Macy. Yes. Councillor Marfleet. Yes. Councillor Matthews. Yes. Councillor Maughan. Yes. Councillor McNally. Yes. Councillor Mrs Newton. Councillor Mrs Overton. Yes. Councillor Oxby. Yes. Councillor Parker. No. Councillor Pepper. Yes. Councillor Mrs Pearson Williams. Yes. Councillor Reid. Yes. Councillor Renshaw. No. Councillor Skinner. Yes. Councillor Mrs Sneath. Yes. Councillor Spencer. Yes. Councillor Spratt. Councillor Stokes. Yes. Councillor Storer. Yes. Councillor Strange. Yes. Councillor Strengle. Yes. Councillor Mrs Talbot. Yes. Councillor Thompson. Yes. Councillor Mrs Trollope-Bellew. Yes. Councillor Whittington. Yes. Councillor Mrs Woolley. Yes. Councillor Mrs Wooten. Yes. Councillor Wooten. Yes. Councillor Worth. Yes. Councillor Young. Yes. Any councillor whose name I have not called?
We have the results. The yeses are 54 and the noes are 9 with no abstentions. Thank you. So the motion is carried. Before we move on to item 7, I'd like to move that we instate the procedure rules. Do I have a seconder?
I'll second that, Chairman.
Thank you. Right. All those in favour? Right. Thank you. We'll move on to item number 7 and the Council Business Plan for 2017-18. Councillor Martin Hill.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Having just set the Council budget for the year, obviously, logically now, we then need to agree the Council Business Plan. This has obviously had consultation. It's been to the scrutiny committees, overview and scrutiny committee, to the executive, and this is the following going that journey through all of those various scrutiny arrangements. This is now presented to this council for this council's approval for the following year. It is all included in the main agenda item.
Thank you, Councillor. Do I have a seconder?
I'd like to second that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. We have nobody indicating that they want to... Oh, I do beg pardon, one's just appeared. Councillor Hilton Spratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to refer to page 27 and 28 of the report, which is something very close to my heart. That is reducing adult offending and reducing young people offending and re-offending. I'd like to ask the Leader of the Council, or not just ask him, but tell him why I support, why I want to say something on this, and that is to bring in a programme of restorative justice, which the Council should probably consider running in partnership with the probation service. I think it goes without saying, a lot of people are in prison who probably ought not to be in prison. And they're in prison because there's nothing else that can be done with them, in the sense that there are limited options that the courts can hand out in terms of sentences. There's no point in fining people if they can't afford to pay fines. Now, when the Conservatives were in control of the City Council across the road for about 15 minutes, we introduced a restorative justice programme. And the restorative justice programme was a partnership between the probation service, who at that point, and I would suspect now, have a lot of difficulty getting placements for people to carry out manual activities within the community, good deeds to put something back into society. And we organised a deal with them, and we ran that programme. I was the portfolio holder for it at the time, and it worked quite well, and there is evidence up and down the country that these restorative justice programmes genuinely help to stop reoffending. It punishes people who are wrongdoers, but it also helps, and the important point about punishing people is not just punishing them for the point of retribution, but also sorting them out to allow them to reform so that they do not reoffend. And I think if we could organise a programme like that with the county and the probation service, there are a lot of things in the community that could be done that don't get done. Part of what we did, we negotiated where they would sweep up and clean up round old people's homes, for example. We're not just talking about like the old schemes in the old days, counting lampposts and things like that and digging holes and filling them in again. We're talking about genuine work in the community. And I know I can't remember, sorry, Councillor Strange, I can't remember the full name of the committee, but I know that there are lots of things that need doing in the countryside, cleaning things up and such like. And if we could do such a programme, I think that would help us meet our commitment to reduce adult reoffending, put people back into the community instead of locking them up in prison. And I think that would be a very positive step for people. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Barry Young.
Thank you, Chairman. I am disappointed that Councillor Spratt is not aware of the amount of work that Lincolnshire County Council does in this area already. Most of it is through the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership, of which I am chairman. We work very closely with probation and all other relevant agencies, including the police. We also run programs such as he's recommending, work in the community to pay some sort of penalty, if you like, without necessarily involving jail. So I'm glad that he agrees with something that perhaps he didn't know much about, but I hope that's put the record straight.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Chris Brewis.
Be very, very brief. I totally agree with the principle of what Councillor Spratt said. We lock far too many people up in this country, and in effect we send them to crime school, don't we? So they pick up tricks and come out even better able to carry them out they can. But I think Barry, as so often, has set the record straight, because as Crime and Disorder Committee, as a number of members know, we have discussed this matter on a number of occasions in the recent years. But I'm sure at the end of the day, if national policy allowed, we could do a great deal more. If we want to look across the water and see how they do it in Scandinavia, ultimately that's what we want to copy, but that is national policy to do that.
Thank you, Councillor. No more... Councillor Eddie Strangle.
Thank you, Chairman. As you probably know, I'm a very calming influence between two colleagues here, but not necessarily against the opposition, of course. But I agree with Councillor Spratt, and I indeed was in a position of influence, shall we say, when we brought in this policy in the past. What I would say to Councillor Young, though, is that we don't seem to see it. We don't seem to see the results on the streets, and perhaps more visibility. I'm not suggesting for the time being anyway, orange jumpsuits or balls and chains, although I suppose if I had my way that might differ. However, I do believe that Councillor Spratt's made a good point, and so has Councillor Young. And I think, working together, what I'd like to see is more visibility of these people actually doing something in the community. I'm not even sure if people that are on community service are seen doing anything in the city. I must admit, on one occasion, I drove through Lincoln very, very early in the morning, around about 5 o'clock, and there were actually people picking up the sort of takeaway stuff off the streets. Now, if that's the case, that's fine, but I still think that we should see that, and it is a very good point on restorative justice as well, that they can actually put something back. And indeed, the important thing here, Chairman, is to turn people round and get them back into the community. So I agree, perhaps, with both, which is unusual for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Paul Key.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's basically what Councillor Spratt brought up about, the restorative justice and these people, being out there, seen doing things. There's a cost to this as well, because I work on the street, so I get, close proximity to some of these offenders. I even speak to someone, they are human beings. And the difference is, on a lot of it, is somebody mentioned about the country roads. Now, that brings a whole plethora of problems, because you can't have people on working on 60-mile-an-hour roads without cones and the like. I work for West Lindsey, so I know we have to do this, you know. So all that sort of thing, it's a good idea, but where I find, or I've seen it, the Trinity Arts Centre in Gainsborough, they had these lads, well, young men, out there litter picking the church ground. So like every morning they were just in the same place doing the same bit. Just down the steps is the street where I'm cleaning, and you know, I could have done with a hand. But the main thing is they are limited basically to where they can go. So I agree with Councillor Strengle that it's the visibility issue should be the one. I know they have done some fantastic work in some places. I mean, some of them don't really want to do a lot, and others go beyond what they want to do. I've seen a lady once, she was down on her hand, had already swept the street, and she was down on her knees with a little brush and dustpan and making sure she got the last few bits up. That's brilliant. Where the bit goes wrong, where they're kicking their heels, or they're maybe effing and jeffing a little bit, something like that, you know. But I agree with Councillor Strengle, they should be seen and visibly doing something. The country road thing, it needs looking into before you start tackling that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marianne Overton.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to pick up a different point on page 44 about the recycling. Again, the targets, I gather there, are under red, so not being met. The point about the contamination of the materials is an issue in that the excuse me, in that the contracts that we have for treatment of the recycling waste, those contracts are limited in that they want to, obviously the contractors only want to take products that make them money, which you can understand. But that does mean that we are therefore left with a higher level of contamination in the amounts of waste that we would like. They call something contamination if it's not in their contract to be recycled. It doesn't mean it's contaminated and dirty. It means it's not in their contract. And the problem with this is that it makes it very difficult with having a tight contract. Yes, it's cost effective, it seems, but then we're left with this other waste that's going to need to be dealt with. And the regulations are likely to tighten. They're still in Europe. Those regulations are going to come to us. They're going to be adopted. And I was talking in Brussels earlier this week, representing the CEMR, which is 130,000 councils across Europe. And the point we were making is that we were asking for the regulations not to be too harsh because they'll be expensive. So I'm working, you know, I think we need to be aware of this. This is not a soft thing that we can just put to one side and say it means little. It actually could be a really important issue for us. And I know our officers will want to work very effectively on it. It's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Graham Cullen.
Thank you, Chairman. Just on the young offenders, I agree. What it is, we've got North Sea Camp not far from us, and we get loads of the young ones, and people do see them. They come and clear sand, and you know, and people go up and talk to them, and they do say where they're from. And we now be doing a big garden project with them. So yes, we do see them around, and people do go and talk to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, Councillor Hill, would you like to respond?
Thank you. Well, I think I'll deal with Councillor Overton's point first. Yes, there is an issue about contamination. I don't think the core issue here is the contract and people being, you know, sticking to a contract, which of course you can't blame them. The key problem is that the market for recyclists has effectively collapsed internationally. So inevitably, when there was a good market, people were prepared to be a lot, receivers of the recyclates were a lot less picky, shall we say, over what they accepted. And I think we're back to the Lincolnshire Waste Partnership, and because it's one of the difficulties of a two-tier area where one authority collects the waste and another authority then disposes of it, which is very important. That I know the good work that Councillor Pole's doing in trying to regenerate the Lincolnshire Waste Partnership will be good, and we'll be aware, you're all aware that there is about a food waste pilot is about to start in South Kesteven, and that'll be an example to see what we can do. But it's not an easy issue, and if we can get rid of that contamination, it would be a great help, not only to the finances of the County Council, but also to, obviously, the environment and making sure more stuff is recycled at a reasonable price. Obviously, a long debate about restorative justice, and I think Councillor Young is correct that work is being done. But I think the other councillor has... Councillor Spratt, sorry, Councillor Spratt has a valid point, and I don't, you know, I think if you just say, well, we're doing it already, that's all right, isn't it? Clearly, there are some. If you look at the business plan, there are some targets not being met related to reoffending and all the rest of it. We did have a positive relationship with the prison, with the previous prison governor, where there was a lot of work we were doing in restorative justice, and I think Councillor Spratt has a very valid point, and we are looking at, I know my colleague Councillor Davis is looking at ways that we can do exactly that, where people work on the highways, where there are stuff on the highways which we no longer do, and I've seen where it would be really visible and see. So I do support him, actually, although I do acknowledge my friend Councillor Young here is doing valuable work. We can always do more, though, and I welcome your contribution, Councillor Spratt. Following that, I would now like to move that the business plan is now adopted for the forthcoming year.
Thank you, Councillor. We'll move straight to the vote with a show of hands. Those in favour? Those against? Any abstentions? Then that vote is carried. Move on to item 8, the interim arrangements following the resignation of the Chief Executive. Councillor Hill.
Yes, obviously, as the Chief Executive will leave this authority on the 28th of February, so obviously we need arrangements in the interim until a new Chief Executive is appointed. So this is just the technical details of, we need to appoint, the technical thing is a head of paid service, but in this council, the head of paid service is normally the Chief Exec, so what we're suggesting here is that what we're proposing is that Richard Wills becomes Head of Paid Service, Acting Chief Exec effectively, and then the Chief Legal Officer will then become the Monitoring Officer. And there is some more detail in the book about some small some of the current duties of Tony McArdle would be going across the Senior Management Board, the CMB, but the majority of his current roles will be picked up by Richard Wills, who will also continue doing his other role as Director of Economy and Environment. So that's the proposal, Chairman.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder?
Yep, I'd like to formally second this item and reserve my right to speak if necessary. Thank you.
Nobody else wishing to speak, so we'll move straight to the... Councillor Parker? Right. We'll move to the vote then. Those in favour? Those against? Any abstentions? Then that vote is carried. Moving on to item 9, the Lincolnshire Health and Wellbeing Board membership. Councillor Sue Woolley.
Thank you, Chairman. The Health and Wellbeing Board, as you know, has a few responsibilities, but one of those is to encourage and support the integration of health and social care. Health and Wellbeing Boards came on the scene in 2013, and I had a recommended list of, or a minimum recommended list, I should say, of people who should be sitting around the table. So whilst Health and Wellbeing Boards come in all shapes and sizes, the Lincolnshire one has kept to quite a core group of individuals. And obviously, since 2013, things have moved on and things have changed. And so this is a proposal that we should follow others within the country, that it's been recognised that it's good practice to invite the Police Crime Commissioner to have a seat at the table, which is one of the proposals. The other I would like to put forward is that the chairman of the Lincolnshire Coordinating Board, that's Elaine Bayliss, who is actually chairman of the Lincolnshire Community Health Trust and indeed interim chairman of the United Lincolnshire Hospital Trust, also becomes a member of the board. Before we just move on, though, can I just draw your attention, a slight amendment on page 157, and I do apologise for not noticing it sooner, but there's actually reference about halfway down the list of representatives that a designated representative from the NHS Commissioning Board, that should actually read from the from NHS England. So that's just a small amendment. But other than that, I would like to put forward these proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Do I have a seconder?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, sorry. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to second that. No, I was just writing.
Thank you, Councillor. Right, we have Councillor Sarah Dodds.
Thank you, Chairman. I would just like to propose a slight amendment, which I think you have before you. I hope you have before you anyway. I think one of the defining features of this council is really good practice in terms of scrutiny and overview, in terms of political proportionality, and I think there's a real understanding that, in fact, the involvement of people from across the political spectrum in the council adds to increased benefit within the scrutiny process. If I refer back to the Lincolnshire Safeguarding Board scrutiny subgroup, there's real great efforts there made to make sure that that group is politically proportionate, and also that it includes as many partners from other strategic organisations within the overview and scrutiny process. And I know that when I've talked to people about that model elsewhere nationally at conferences, that is really recognised as being good practice and actually unique for Lincolnshire. And I think what we're asking here as a Labour group is that good practice that we see elsewhere in the council and that we genuinely appreciate being part of is actually reflected in there. And I think there's a slight concern that this wasn't picked up within the review that was undertaken. So you'll see the amendment quite simply stated on the sheet, and that where it says 5 further councillors, it reads 1 of which should be from an opposition party. We're not stipulating which opposition party, there's a few of us to pick from, but it is just a request really that the good practice that is enshrined elsewhere in the council is also extended out to this forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Do I have a seconder for your amendment?
I'd like to motion and reserve my right to speak.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marianne Overton.
Thank you. The point here is that we are trying to be inclusive, and that's what we need. If we are going to have a body like this Health and Wellbeing Board, which effectively is responsible for the health of Lincolnshire, if intended to communicate with the providers to make sure that the services are provided at the right place, at the right time, in order to get effective solutions for people, improvements to make sure that they're able to live healthier for longer. So why wouldn't you include as many different voices as you can? Why wouldn't you include different political groups? We do right across our councils, as we've got legislation that says that we do need representation by proportion on all of the committees. And that was set out legally for a reason, because the intention is to be representative and to be fair and correct, and therefore make better decisions. So I would support this. I would actually support going further in that it should be politically balanced, I believe, in the same way that the police panel was set up to be politically balanced, because these are organisations that are big, they're important, they have a huge impact on our residents and therefore it's only right that there should be a fair proportion of all voices at the table. So I support the amendment, and I would even support it going further. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Patricia Bradwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't think I was going to have to say something, but I feel I must. Obviously, this, as Councillor Woolley said, this committee was set up in 2013 as instructed by government, and the committee isn't a council committee. I mean, we oversee it, but actually it is about having its health partners and the county council, and so actually it doesn't have to be politically balanced. There is no rules or anything in that constitution that says it has to be politically balanced. And actually, we do have district councillors on there at the moment as well. And actually, the district councillor who's on there actually has come from Lincoln City at the moment. But, I mean, so we try to have a cross-section of people across the county. As I say, we've got different health colleagues. We've included our district councils because we feel that they are closer, actually, to communities than we are as a county council. And so therefore I don't believe this is an issue, to be honest. I just think you know, we should carry on. My recommendation is that we should carry on as we are now. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Martin Hill.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Obviously this isn't a committee of the County Council, and obviously it is also a bringing together, and obviously we put people on from all organisations, not just the County Council, they're all listed there, where they bring to the table their what they require. It's quite an important committee that we're being very careful to make sure that the County Council is protected in this situation. And I think and it's also it's a difficult balancing act, because there are always people who think they should have more places on, and we are quite unique in this part of the world where we are clear that the County Council should actually have a clear view on what's going on. There is a danger in all of this that other people will come forward to try and spend our money for us, and I think there is a risk that could happen. So in terms of the actual proposal, it would have been helpful, frankly, if we'd seen it earlier, so there would have been chance for a broader discussion. And obviously there is a national sort of drive from the police and crime commissioners from the Home Office to actually get police and crime commissioners on these health and wellbeing boards, which I think we would support, but it does upset the sort of balance we've got to, and I'm quite confident that other organisations will come forward. In addition, of course, as Councillor Woolley has said, there is changes in the CCG structures at the moment. So I think at this time, I think personally I would not support the amendment, but it would have been helpful if it had come forward earlier, so we could have given it due consideration and thought about it. So at this time, I personally, I don't think we should support it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sue Woolley.
Thank you, Chairman. It was just very quickly, but Tricia's beaten me to it, to point out that actually there is a member of the opposition that does sit on this particular committee. It's the district councillor, is actually Councillor Donald Nanstead from Lincoln City Council, and he represents all of the district councils.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rob Parker.
Thank you. Excuse me, it's not working. Okay, Martin Hill said, you know, it wasn't brought earlier. Okay, let's accept that, and irrespective of results, should we say this is advance notice for the AGM in May? So that's a marker. I just want to pick up some of the words that we used, actually. It's a cross-section. You know, it's a cross-section of something, but it's certainly not a cross-section of the County Council, and I just want to make that point. It's not a committee of the County Council, was another point that was made, but neither is representation on the LGA, and the Conservatives have agreed that, that we would have a non-Conservative member. The same with the County Council's network. So, in one sense, it doesn't have to be a committee of the County Council because there's already a policy of inclusion, and I think that's good. I think the couple of words that were used that I have the most difficulty with, this is an important committee, as though the likes of us, we don't go on important committees because, that's restricted. So the fact that the statement was made this is an important committee and none of us from Labour, Independent, Liberal Democrat, etc. on it doesn't actually read very well from our point of view. I think that there needs to be some explanation as to why we happen to have, by accident or design, 8 members of the council on this committee, the Executive Council for NHS Liaison, Adult Care, Libraries Heritage, and 5 further county councillors. Now that's 8. Okay. I'm not so sure what you think that, that we would bring that would be disruptive and somehow alter the way that the system is operating at the moment, but we're talking about an opposition party because it demonstrates openness, doesn't it? It demonstrates inclusivity, and we think we have a contribution to make. It's as simple as that. If it can't be accepted now, then certainly some consideration ought to be given at the annual general meeting. I did wonder what was meant by Councillor Woolley when she said there is an opposition member. I think it was yourself, so if I'm wrong. Donald Nanastad. Well, I don't think he sees himself as an opposition member when it comes to sitting on a board like this. He sees himself as the Deputy Leader of Lincoln City Council and representing the districts. Now, if that phrase opposition member was seen as anybody who's not on the County Council is somehow in opposition, then I think that was perhaps not quite what you meant. But eight councillors from this council sit on this Health and Wellbeing Board, none of which are members of the opposition. I think that speaks for itself as an argument if we're looking for inclusivity, as is demonstrated by membership of the LGA and the County Councils Network. So I'm happy to second this motion.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sue Woolley, do you want to respond before we move to the vote?
Everything that needs to be said has been said.
Thank you. Then we'll move to a vote on the amendment shown by hands. All those in favour? All those against? Any abstentions? So that is defeated. We move then straight to the vote, the original report, and all those in favour? Those against? Any abstentions? Then that original one is carried. Moving on to item 10, Members' Allowance Scheme for 2018-19. Councillor Martin Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. The Independent Remuneration Panel has done its 4-yearly report into recommendations for members' allowances. There are very few changes, effective changes in the what is being proposed. I think 2 posts are proposed for changes in the remuneration. There is a new remuneration, and the rest of them, although there are issues there regarding the Health and Wellbeing Board, it's important to remember that the principle on which they recommend is continued, that we only accept one remuneration as a special responsibility allowance. So I think it's fairly straightforward. There is no change to the basic allowance proposed, and I think hopefully that would meet with the swift approval of this council.
Thank you, Councillor. Any councillors wishing to comment? Oh, sorry, before I move on, do I have a seconder?
I'll second, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Newton. Right. Don't think we have anybody indicating... Oh, Councillor...
Marianne Overton. Thank you. I would just like to say thank you to the Remuneration Committee, who did seem to, as far as I could see, look very carefully at all of the issues and think very carefully about it. So thank you for their thoughtful work.
Thank you. We'll move straight to the vote. Those in favour? Those against? Any abstentions? Thank you. Move on to item 11, Pay Policy Statement. Councillor Martin Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. This is now a requirement that this paper comes before the Council at this time. Basically, at the back of the papers there, it is just publicly showing what our pay policy statement is, and all the information is there in terms of pay scales and all the rest of it. It is a statutory document. It was overseen by the relevant committee, Pay Policy Committee, basically group leaders and a few others, and it shows the sort of banding of pay that our staff receive and the policies. No great changes from last year.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Barry Young.
I'm happy to second the motion, Chairman, but I reserve the right to speak in any debate.
Thank you. Looking for anybody wishing to speak, and there's nobody indicating that they want to, so we'll move straight to the vote. Those in favour? Those against? Any abstentions? Then that is carried. That concludes the items on the agenda for today. Can I thank you all for attending and putting up with me? Thank you very much.